Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The Slow Fortune of Ezra Pike. Ezra Pike wasn't born with much more than a stubborn streak and a knack for sitting quiet while others rattled themselves broke. Folks in the town of Calder's Bluff said he had eyes like still water, hard to read, steady, no matter how rough the wind blew. When he was young, he worked odd jobs, splitting logs, mending fences, sweeping saloon floors, nothing that would set a man apart. But where others spent their pay on whiskey or dice, Ezra tucked his coins away in an old tobacco tin, hid beneath the floorboard of the shack he called home. It wasn't that Ezra feared spending. He just believed in letting money catch its breath. A dollar that ain't rushed, he used to mutter, is a dollar that'll bring friends back home. His neighbors laughed, calling him tight-fisted, a miser, or worse. But Ezra didn't mind. He had patience, and patience was the one thing most men couldn't hold. Years drifted on, and while others chased schemes, mines that went bust, land grabs that left them owing taxes, Ezra kept to steady work. He bought tools instead of trinkets, boots instead of bets, and when the old mill on the edge of town went up for auction, rusted near to ruin, Ezra was the only man in Bluff who had coin enough to raise his hand. The crowd scoffed at it, said he bought himself a pile of rotten timber, but Ezra only nodded, slid his hands into his worn coat, and walked home like he'd just planted seeds in spring soil. That winter, while snow pressed hard against every roof, Ezra was down at the mill, patching leaks, oiling gears, and teaching himself how the whole contraption breathed. He hauled sacks of grain till his back ached, fixed belts with scraps of leather, and by spring thaw, the mill wheel was turning again. Farmers who'd been carting grain 3 towns over now found Ezra door open, prices fair, scales honest. Word spread slow but sure, like creek water. What Ezra understood, what most never did, was that steady trust is worth more than silver. He never cheated a measure, never turned away a man who came short on coin if his word was good. Farmers began leaving not just grain, but their savings in Ezra care, saying they'd rather him keep it safe than watch it vanish in a banker panic 2 counties away. Ezra didn't set out to be a banker, but that what patience made of him. Years rolled on, and that tobacco tin under his floorboards was long since replaced by ledgers, each marked neat and true. The mill grew into a granary, the granary into a trading hall. Calder's Bluff, once a dusty pit stop, became a place where folks felt their sweat wasn't wasted. Ezra never built no mansion, never strutted in fine clothes. He still lived in that shack, though he patched it good and tight. His fortune wasn't in gold piled high, but in the way folks tipped their hats when he passed, knowing their children's bellies were full because a quiet man had chosen patience over pride. And when his hair turned silver, Ezra Pike would sit out by his fire, rain tapping soft on the roof, telling any young'un who'd listen, "Don't chase the storm, son. Build your roof steady and let the rain do the rest." Ezra Pike's firelight wisdom didn't end with his own hands keeping the mill turning, or with his ledgers holding townsfolk coin. As the years went on, his quiet brand of wealth, steady, unhurried, and built on trust, started seeping out into the very soil of Calder's Bluff. Men who once laughed at his tobacco tin ways found themselves recalling his patience when the railroad boom came thundering through the county. Slick strangers in fine hats rolled into town promising quick fortunes for any man who'd sign over his land for stock in a railway spur. They dazzled folks with shiny maps, poured whiskey down gullets, and by the time the sun rose, too many farms had been signed away for paper that wasn't worth the ink. But not Ezra. He walked into those meetings, sat in the back with his arms folded, and when the young farmers asked his counsel, he said just one thing: don't sell the ground your boots have memorized. The man who holds the soil holds the supper. Some listened, some didn't. Within 2 years, the railroad men had vanished, and those who sold were left plowing dust or working as hired hands on what used to be their own fields. The ones who kept faith in Ezra Way found themselves the backbone of a community that hadn't been stripped bare. Ezra's influence grew not by speeches or threats, but by the living proof that patience bore fruit. He started setting aside coin for widows who lost husbands to fever, made quiet loans without interest for families struggling through drought, and in time, those folks paid him back with sweat and gratitude. What mattered most wasn't the coin itself, but the circle of faith it created. Men would say, if Ezra trusts you, that's worth more than any banker's stamp. Then came the flood of '93, when the river swelled from weeks of unyielding rain. Barns collapsed, livestock drowned, and crops were washed clean from the fields. Panic could have broken Calder's Bluff then and there, but Ezra Pike didn't flinch. He opened the granary doors, handed out what grain was stored, and told the town, "This ain't charity, it's survival. Pay me back when you can, but make sure your young ones eat tonight." Folks still speak of that winter like a miracle. While other towns starved, Bluff pulled through on the shoulders of one-man foresight and the trust he had cultivated like seed in spring. By then, Ezra had long since crossed the line from miller to steward of the whole community fortune. He never claimed the title, but he was their banker, their advisor, their safety net. And with that role came a kind of respect money alone could never buy. Parents told their children about the man who built an empire without a vault, who grew rich without greed, and who proved wealth could be as quiet as rain seeping into the earth. As the new century edged closer, bigger changes loomed. Telegraph wires buzzing, banks consolidating, factories humming louder each year. Young folks itched to chase city fortunes, dazzled by electric lights and steel towers. Some said Calder's Bluff would shrivel without joining in the modern stampede. Ezra just leaned back in his chair, eyes on the horizon, and said, "Fortunes made fast got legs made of clay. Fortunes built slow stand like mountains." Sure enough, when markets crashed in far-off cities and banks folded overnight, Bluff people hardly flinched. Their wealth wasn't tied up in promises on paper, but in fields, granaries, and the steady trust Ezra had taught him to build. His way of patience and prudence had turned a dusty pit stop into one of the most resilient little towns on the frontier. In the twilight of his life, Ezra Pike would still walk down to the mill some mornings, even if the work was long since handed to younger hands. He'd tip his hat to the farmers carting grain, watch the wheel turn slow and steady, and smile faintly at the thought that what he'd built wasn't measured in coin but in the calm eyes of neighbors who knew hunger and fear had been beaten back by trust. He'd sit by the fire at night, listening to the rain drumming gentle on the roof, and whisper to himself, "$1 given time is a seed, and seeds don't hurry for any man." His story outlasted him, carried by every person who ever put away a coin instead of spending it quick, who ever chose the long road instead of the short thrill. Ezra Pike became less a man than a kind of campfire tale, told under stormy skies to remind folks that fortune isn't a strike of lightning, it's the steady burn of a lantern kept alive through the dark. After Ezra Pike passed on, the town didn't build a statue nor carve his likeness into stone. That wasn't his way, and the people of Calder's Bluff knew better than to honor a man with cold rock when his legacy already breathed in every home and barn. Instead, they carried forward the habits he'd planted deep, treating them not as rules but as common sense handed down like recipes or hymns. Parents told their children, "Save first, spend second." Neighbors echoed, "Don't lean on promises you can't touch." And farmers said, "A crop is worth more in the ground than in a gambler hand." These weren't lofty proverbs scribbled into books. They were simple truths Ezra had proven time and again, truths so deeply woven into Bluff fabric that even strangers felt their weight when they set foot there. Ezra left no heirs of his own blood, but in a way, the whole town became his kin. He had mentored a quiet handful of younger folks, boys and girls who'd lingered by the mill or stopped to help him tally a ledger. To them, he'd passed down not only the art of numbers, but the patience to let those numbers breathe. One such boy, Thomas, grew into the town's first official treasurer, and his office bore none of the pomp you'd expect in a city bank. It was a humble room with open ledgers, no locked doors, and a chair by the window for any neighbor who wanted to ask about crops, debt, or marriage savings. Thomas often said, "Ezra taught me that trust is worth more than interest." And with those words, he refused more than once to squeeze a desperate man with terms he couldn't meet. Years rolled on, and the bluff thrived in quiet defiance of the world's storms. When a nationwide panic swept through banks in the early 1900s, bigger towns saw doors shut and vaults emptied. Men in suits leapt from windows in despair. But Calder's Bluff? The people shrugged, went about their business, and told reporters who came sniffing for tragedy, "Our wealth in wheat, cattle, and in the neighbor who'll lend you seed when you're short." Ezra Way had made the bluff near immune to the tides that wrecked other shores. Stories of their resilience spread beyond the county, catching the ears of weary farmers in nearby valleys and even in distant states. Families drifted in, tired of promises from railroads, factories, and slick financiers. They wanted what the bluff had, a place where money wasn't a master, just a tool. The town grew, not into a bustling city, but into a steadier, broader community. Each new arrival learned fast that the real currency there was honesty and patience, and if they couldn't stomach that, they packed up soon enough. What kept it alive wasn't blind loyalty to a dead man's words, but the proof in the lives of those who followed him. Ezra had shown that a life free of hurry and greed gave more peace than any coin-choked bank could offer. That peace was contagious, and in time, the bluff became a kind of beacon. Preachers told his tale from pulpits, travelers spread it by word of mouth, and it reached young men in cities who longed for steadier ground beneath their boots. One such young man, Robert Colson, fled the chaos of a collapsing bank job in St. Louis and stumbled into Bluff with nothing but a satchel. He found work with Thomas, and though he first sneered at the slow pace and open ledgers, it wasn't long before the quiet trust got under his skin. Robert married, raised children, and became one of the fiercest protectors of the Bluff way, proving once more that Ezra Flame didn't die but passed like a torch from hand to hand. By the time decades had passed, Calder's Bluff had become more than a town. It was a living parable. Wealth seekers came expecting a secret formula and left with something harder but truer: patience, work, and the courage to say no to shiny lies. The people called it Ezra Wealth not because it belonged to him, but because he had first named the truth they all lived by. And though the fire at his old cabin long cooled, folks still gathered at the spot on stormy nights, sitting in a circle, telling the younger ones about the man who proved that fortune grows not from the loud strike of opportunity, but from the quiet drip of persistence. Around those campfires, with rain pattering steady on tin roofs, Ezra Pike's voice lived on, a ghost not of fear but of guidance. And in every pause, every slow breath, the lesson returned. True wealth don't hurry, it don't shout, and it don't vanish when markets quake. It waits, patient as seed in winter, sure as spring that follows. The world beyond Calder's Bluff marched on with roaring engines, electric lights, and the shrill tick of factory clocks. Yet inside the town, time moved to its own slower rhythm. That didn't mean the folks resisted progress. They welcomed the train line that finally stretched close enough to haul their crops without the brutal wagon rides, and they took to electricity when it reached their valley. But unlike other places, they didn't let progress push them into debt or frenzy. Every improvement was weighed against Ezra's old wisdom. If it don't steady the ground you walk on, it ain't worth the shine. That saying got scrawled on chalkboards at school, nailed above workbenches, even murmured by mothers reminding children not to beg for toys they didn't need. Visitors thought it quaint at first, like they'd stumbled into a living museum. They expected suspicion toward outsiders, yet found the Bluff warm and open, so long as a man or woman respected their way of life. Merchants explained their prices plainly. No hidden fees, no slick tricks. Even the children played games that mirrored their elders' patience. Marbles and cards carried lessons in fairness, and the rule of thumb was always, don't play what you can't part with. For outsiders raised on quick money and sharper claws, it was baffling at first, but soon enough many grew to crave that steadiness like a parched throat craves water. As the Great Depression sank its teeth into the land, folks streamed into Bluff again, drawn by whispers that it stood untouched by the ruin. They found no gold piled in banks, no fountains spouting silver, just a people who'd never let themselves overreach. Families shared food when cupboards grew bare, and barter kept the town humming when paper dollars turned to dust. A man could trade firewood for a sack of flour or eggs for a half-day labor, and no one felt cheated. What outsiders called survival, the Bluff called life as usual. The Depression years sealed the Bluff reputation. Reporters came, scribbling notes, snapping photographs of men in plain coats and women baking bread by the dozen. They tried to paint it as a miracle, but the locals laughed gently at the notion. "Ain't no miracle, Thomas, old and gray by then," told one journalist. "It just Ezra way. Don't spend what you ain't got. Don't promise what you can't keep. and don't measure wealth by the noise it makes. That line made it into papers across the Midwest, and suddenly Ezra Pike was hailed as some kind of prophet. Yet the Bluff never chased that fame. They shrugged it off, knowing attention fades quicker than fortune built on sand. The years rolled into war, and many young men of the Bluff answered the call. They wrote letters home from faraway lands, often remarking how the lessons of patience and thrift carried them through foxholes and barracks. Some even said that while others lost their wages in reckless games or hasty spending, they saved, sent money home, and dreamed of returning to steady soil. The Bluff, in turn, welcomed them back with open arms, no man richer or poorer in respect for what he'd done. By the time highways cut across the land and television sets flickered in living rooms, the Bluff traditions might have seemed relics. But instead of fading, they adapted. The younger generation took Ezra rules and bent them to fit a modern frame. They opened credit unions instead of banks, cooperatives instead of big box stores. They saved not only in dollars, but in trust. Neighbors co-signed for each other, loans bore little or no interest, and nobody feared being cast out for falling short once in a while. That system baffled economists who stopped through, scratching their heads at a place where defaults were rare and prosperity slow but certain. It wasn't paradise. Fights happened, tempers flared, and not everyone agreed on every choice. But even in conflict, Ezra wisdom served as a compass. If an argument broke out over land or trade, the first question wasn't who gains most, but what steadies the ground. That principle alone kept feuds short and peace long. Outsiders marveled that lawsuits were nearly unheard of, replaced instead by meetings on porches, talks over coffee, or simple handshakes in the town hall. As the Bluff grew older, so did its legend. Travelers who stopped by told stories of Ezra ghosts still walking the fields on rainy nights, lantern in hand, checking fences and crops like he never left. Children swore they'd seen him by the riverbank, nodding approvingly when they skipped stones or helped their mothers fetch water. Whether true or not didn't matter. The point was that his name lived, stitched into the fabric of every hearth and field. His story became less about the man and more about the living proof that wealth could be built without trickery, without ruinous haste. In a world that spun faster and louder with each passing decade, Calder's Bluff stood like an island of calm. Folks passing through often said it felt like stepping into another time, where coins jingled quieter and promises carried heavier weight. And while many came chasing fortune, they left with something rarer, a steadiness of soul, the kind Ezra himself carried like a lantern through dark nights. The new century came like a storm, with glowing screens in every hand and money no longer counted just in bills or coins, but in shifting numbers on invisible ledgers. Where once a man might have kept his savings folded in a tobacco tin or tucked inside a worn leather wallet, now it lived on servers humming in far-off cities. For most places, the change brought confusion, scams, and the sort of temptations Ezra himself had once warned against, fortunes promised in a blink, trust bent by faceless corporations, and the creeping itch to gamble on things one couldn't even touch. But in Calder's Bluff, the spirit of Ezra lessons endured like the campfire flames they still lit on cold nights. They didn't shut their doors to progress, no, but they met it the same way they met every shiny new contraption, with cautious eyes and steady hands. When the first townsfolk opened accounts online, they did so together. Families gathered in the old schoolhouse, laptops glowing like lanterns, while one of the younger Bluff-born, a lad named Samuel who'd studied computing in the city, explained in plain words how it all worked. This ain't no different than your passbooks, he told them. It's just numbers moving quicker. But remember what Ezra said? Fast don't always mean safe. The older folks nodded, understanding that the new world could be used wisely if treated with the same patience as planting a field. Samuel became something of a bridge between the old Bluff and the wired world. Instead of chasing high-flying startups or risky ventures, he showed his neighbors how to use the internet to strengthen what they already had. Farmers pooled their resources to sell crops online at fair prices. Artisans crafted quilts and furniture that traveled far beyond the valley, and young students took classes that once required train rides to the city. Each time someone suggested plunging into speculative schemes, cryptocurrencies that rose and fell like wild rivers or promises of instant riches from strangers, Samuel reminded them of Ezra's line, "If it don't steady the ground you walk on, it ain't worth the shine." And so, even in a digital age, Calder's Bluff prospered. Not through haste, not through reckless bets, but through careful weaving of the new into the old. Families still gathered for potlucks, only now recipes might have been shared from kin living across oceans. The town co-op opened a website, but the handshake at the counter still sealed most deals. A kind of balance emerged, proof that progress didn't have to erase roots, it could water them if one was mindful.
One winter night, long after the first snow had settled on the rooftop,
Samuel sat with the elders by a roaring fire outside the town hall. Sparks floated skyward like a chorus of fireflies. The talk turned, as it often did, to Ezra Pike. "Do you reckon," asked Clara, who'd seen 92 winters, "that Ezra could have imagined this world of ours? Screens in every pocket, coins turned to code." Samuel smiled. "Maybe not the shape of it, but the heart of it. I think he knew." His words weren't about coins or cattle. They were about people keeping steady when the world tries to shake you loose. They fell quiet then, listening to the crackle of the fire, the hiss of snow melting on logs. For a moment, it seemed Ezra himself might step out of the shadows, lantern in hand, nodding at the sight of his legacy alive in a world he'd never touched. By the next spring, a project took root in the Bluff One that would carry Ezra wisdom farther than even the train lines or telegraphs had managed. Samuel and a group of younger townsfolk began recording stories of the elders, setting them to soft music and sharing them across the internet. They called it Fireside Finance, a humble channel where voices told of patience, of steady hands, of wealth that meant more than numbers. Strangers across the world, tired of noise and chasing shadows, stumbled upon those tales. They listened by their own fires, in apartments and houses far removed from the valley, and felt a strange comfort. Letters, then emails, poured into the Bluff. Folks wrote of death's ease, of lives slowed to a gentler pace, of finding courage to turn down promises too shiny to be true. And in every letter, one phrase returned again and again: "Your stories steady the ground beneath me." The Bluff, once a quiet corner unknown to most, had become a lantern in the darkness for people across continents. It wasn't fame the townsfolk sought. They didn't rush to expand or brand themselves with glittering logos. They simply kept telling their stories, gathering by the fire as they always had, while the world beyond listened in awe. The wealth they shared wasn't just financial. It was the kind that lived in steady hearts, in children raised without fear of scarcity, in elders who passed on not just land but wisdom. And so Ezra's legacy, once carried in whispers across a single valley, grew into a chorus that stretched across oceans. His voice lived not in statues or monuments, but in the living rhythm of people who dared to measure wealth not by how fast it came, but by how long it lasted. In a world restless and loud, Calder's Bluff remained steady, a place where the fire burned warm, the lessons rang true, and every story ended not with a chase for riches, but with the quiet, enduring glow of enough. The stories from Calder's Bluff began to ripple outward like rings on a still pond, carried not by the whistle of a train this time, nor by wires strung across hills, but by the invisible current of the internet. What had started as Samuel's quiet project to record the elders' tales soon blossomed into something neither he nor the townsfolk had expected. College students wrote in, saying they listened to the fireside voices during long nights of study, finding calm in the cadence. Truckers on endless highways played the recordings in their cabs, the old cowboy wisdom giving them company as headlights swept across lonely blacktop. Even city bankers, men and women knee-deep in numbers moving faster than Ezra could have imagined, confessed that the Bluff's slow, steady words reminded them of why they worked in the first place. It wasn't polished or glossy. The Bluff had no fancy studio, no million-dollar equipment. The recordings carried the crackle of logs, the whistle of wind sneaking under the door, and sometimes even the cough or chuckle of a neighbor chiming in. But that rawness, that imperfection, was what made it real. Listeners didn't feel like they were being sold something. They felt like they were being welcomed, as if they too had pulled up a chair near the fire. And in a world drowning in noise, that simple honesty shone brighter than neon. As the audience grew, there were voices, outsiders, who came knocking, offering to help the Bluff package their wisdom into something more marketable. One company suggested turning the recordings into a flashy app with monthly subscriptions. Another pitched merchandise, mugs, shirts, even faux campfire kits. But the townsfolk gathered one evening, lanterns glowing in the town hall, and weighed it the same way they'd weigh any investment. Old Thomas, who had little hair left but still carried eyes sharp as hawk feathers, leaned forward and said Ezra didn't speak so folks could turn his words into trinkets. His lessons weren't for sale. They were for sharing. The hall agreed, their voices carrying a quiet conviction. They turned the offers away. The Bluff stories would remain free, just as the fire warmth had always been. Yet even free, the wealth they spread was undeniable. Donations trickled in from grateful listeners, not demanded, not even asked for, but given freely. A farmer in Nebraska sent a letter with a check, saying he doubled his savings after hearing a tale about patience and steady planting. A teacher in Seoul sent a message explaining how the campfire stories helped her students learn about values that crossed borders. Those gifts, modest as they were, went into a community chest. The Bluff used them not for riches, but for good repairing roofs, stocking the food bank, and keeping the library lights burning late for young dreamers. Soon, Samuel realized something profound. Wealth wasn't just being earned in the Bluff anymore, it was being taught, shared, and lived far beyond its borders. The Bluff had become a kind of lighthouse in a stormy financial sea, reminding folks everywhere that wealth meant more than piling up coins. It meant knowing peace at night. It meant seeing children grow without hunger in their eyes. It meant greeting neighbors without envy or fear. There was a night when Samuel himself sat by the fire, alone except for the hiss of snow outside, and thought about Ezra. He imagined the old wanderer standing in the doorway, lantern raised, that slow smile curling under his beard. "You done good," the ghost of Ezra might have said, "not cause you chased riches, but cause you kept the flame steady for others to see." Samuel felt tears in his eyes, not from sadness, but from the weight of carrying a legacy into a world Ezra never walked in. The Bluff continued in its rhythm. Children still sled down snowy hills, merchants still bartered over grain, and neighbors still helped mend fences when storms tore them down. But now, when they gathered at night, they knew their voices stretched farther than the valley. A story told by Clara, whose hands shook but whose spirit never did, might soothe a soul halfway across the globe. A laugh from Thomas might echo in headphones in cities Ezra could never have imagined. And as the fire cracked, the townsfolk understood that they weren't just telling stories anymore. They were weaving a tapestry of wealth that no market crash could undo, no inflation could wither, no scam could steal. It was a wealth measured not by numbers, but by hearts steadied, by families strengthened, by strangers connected across time and distance. The Bluff had always been a small place, but through patience and story, it had grown larger than maps. In quiet corners of the world, listeners whispered thanks into the dark, comforted by voices that carried the scent of pine smoke, the glow of embers, and the wisdom of a man long gone but never forgotten. And there, beneath the stars, Calder's Bluff glowed with a wealth untouchable, a fire no storm could put out. The seasons turned in Calder's Bluff with a rhythm steady as the swing of a porch chair, each one leaving its mark on the stories shared by firelight. Winter hush brought gatherings closer, the hiss of logs and crack of pine, the constant backdrop to voices worn by years. Spring brought renewal, the smell of thawing earth seeping into the cabin walls as the folks outside began planting and tending, their work blending into tales about the patience wealth required. Summer, with its cicadas droning and children's laughter drifting across fields, found the fire pushed to the outdoors, where stars glimmered like silver coins scattered across black velvet. Autumn, golden and cool, carried the weight of harvest, a season when the stories seemed to stretch longest, mirroring the stretch of days into early dark. By now, Samuel wasn't the only one who carried Ezra's legacy of weaving wisdom into tale. Clara, whose voice carried the kind of crackle that reminded listeners of dry leaves crunching underfoot, told about the day she had almost sold her farm out of desperation, only to hold steady and reap double when the market swung. Marcus, a younger man with little more than a fiddle and sharp wit, recounted how he once squandered his wages in reckless games before learning discipline by saving every third coin until it built him a roof over his family head. These weren't rehearsed speeches. They weren't written in ledgers or carved in stone. They were truths lived, mistakes bared, and lessons turned into fireside lanterns. One evening, as a storm rumbled over the ridge, the Bluff was cloaked in rain so heavy it sounded like drums upon the roof. Folks huddled in close, their shadows dancing wild on the log walls. That night, Samuel told a story of a man far beyond the valley, one he'd read about in a crumbling book that had found its way to the library shelf. The man had started with nothing but a small trade, sharpening knives in city alleys, yet built a fortune steady as brickwork by reinvesting each dime and never letting go of his craft. The fire popped when Samuel described how the man, in his final years, gave away more than he had kept, leaving not just money but schools and homes for those who followed. The listeners leaned in, their faces glowing with both the firelight and the idea that wealth properly held was never hoarded but passed forward like kindling. Letters continued arriving in Samuel's hands, the postmaster shaking his head with wonder each time another bundle came. They bore stamps from places none of the Bluff had ever traveled: Oslo, Buenos Aires, Nairobi, Tokyo. People wrote of how the stories had changed them. A student learning to budget small stipends rather than rushing into debt. A widow finding solace in the reminder that patience bore fruit. A small business owner who steadied his hand against panic when storms rattled the markets. And though no riches poured directly into the bluff, the knowledge that their fireside words traveled oceans gave the people a sense of wealth far deeper than coins could measure. Still, the bluff prosperity grew in its own quiet way. The market square was livelier, shops sturdier, homes better stocked, not from sudden gold, but from the collective practice of lessons Ezra had planted and Samuel had tended. Families now saved jars of grain and tucked aside dollars where once they had spent them too fast. When storms came, economic or otherwise, they bent but did not break. There was resilience, the kind wealth alone could never buy. One fall night, with frost sharpening the air and stars bright as lanterns overhead, a traveling scholar stopped in the bluff. She had come from the city, curious about the stories she'd heard whispered by colleagues who listened late at night to the bluff recordings. She stayed a week, sitting quietly in the circle, jotting notes in a leather-bound book. Before leaving, she told them something they'd not considered. What you are doing here is not just preserving memory, it is shaping how people everywhere think about money, time, and life. You're building a treasury, but its currency is wisdom. The bluff folk chuckled, humbled as they were, and went back to their planting, mending, and storytelling. Yet her words lingered, like smoke clinging to a coat. They realized that though they had chosen not to package or sell their tales, they had nonetheless built something larger than wealth trust. In an age where scams and false promises roamed faster than a horse at full gallop, trust was rarer than gold. And by keeping their stories honest and their fire burning bright, they had given the world a fortune few could ever counterfeit. When Samuel walked home that night, lantern swinging gently at his side, he paused at the ridge to look back at the town. Windows glowed warm through the chill, laughter and fiddle music spilling faintly into the dark. He thought of Ezra again, the way the old man had first lit this path with nothing more than a smile, a chair by the fire, and a story. The world had taken that ember and carried it across seas, but here in Calder's Bluff, the flame still burned closest to home, steady and sure. And so the bluff kept telling, kept listening, kept living the lessons that made them rich in ways numbers could never tally. The years rolled forward like wagon wheels on a dusty trail, and Calder's Bluff found itself at a peculiar crossroad. What had begun as a town clinging to survival, its folks patching holes in roofs and pinching pennies to outlast the lean years, had now matured into a community that not only survived but quietly prospered. Yet prosperity, Samuel often reminded them, wasn't simply the clinking of coins in one pocket. It was the steady hand of knowing that tomorrow could be faced with courage rather than dread. One winter evening, as snow muffled the world outside and the fire inside hissed with sap, Samuel leaned back in his chair and spoke of a lesson that had been simmering in his thoughts. "We've learned to save, and we've learned to invest in small ways," he began, his voice carrying low and steady. "But wealth has another face, one that shows itself in what we give away." The room quieted, the usual shuffle of boots and crackle of wood pausing as neighbors turned their ears toward him. Samuel told the story of a merchant he had read about, a man who once traded silks across oceans. The merchant built his fortune slowly, never risking more than he could afford to lose. But what made him remembered wasn't his warehouses full of cloth. It was the school he built for children who'd never have seen the inside of a classroom otherwise. Around the fire, the bluff folk listened, and many of them glanced at their own children, now playing on floors that once knew only dust. For the first time, Samuel's words planted a thought not just of individual security, but of collective strength. What if, he asked, his gaze sweeping the circle, our prosperity wasn't just measured by what we kept, but by what we built for others? That question struck root like oak in spring soil. Over the months that followed, the bluff began small experiments in giving. Clara organized a grain fund for families struck by hard winters, where each neighbor contributed a jarful at harvest. Marcus, who once hoarded every spare coin, now set aside a portion of his earnings to help mend the roof of a widow down the lane. The postmaster offered free lessons in writing to children, so they might one day send their own stories far beyond the ridge. Soon, the bluff had something that rivaled banks and markets, trust woven so thickly between neighbors that no storm could unravel it. And that trust became its own currency. When crops failed in one field, others rushed to share seed. When illness swept through homes, food and warmth were left on doorsteps without expectation of repayment. What Ezra had begun as a circle of stories had become a circle of strength, and in that strength lay a deeper kind of wealth. Word of this giving spirit spread beyond the valley. Travelers passing through carried tales of the bluff's generosity. A tinker on his way to the coast told city folk about a place where no child went hungry in winter. A scholar wrote an essay about how a humble mountain town had created a model of mutual prosperity without a bank ledger or a politician decree. And while the bluff never sought fame, fame found it anyway, stitched into the fabric of stories that continued to wander across oceans. One spring morning, Samuel received a letter with handwriting finer than any he'd seen. It was from a woman in a distant city who had heard the bluff tales. She confessed she had been caught in the snare of wealth's darker side, chasing possessions until her soul was thin as paper. Yet after listening to their stories, she sold half of what she owned and used the proceeds to open a home for orphans. "I do not know your names," she wrote, "but I owe my new life to your firelight." Samuel read the letter aloud by the fire, and when he finished, silence filled the room. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence that comes when words are too small for what the heart feels. Then someone, perhaps Clara, perhaps Marcus, spoke softly, "Seems wealth has a longer reach than any of us reckon." In time, the bluff grew known not for riches but for principles. Merchants came seeking trade, yet they often left carrying more than goods. They carried the memory of evenings by the fire, where truth was spoken without varnish, where mistakes were shared as freely as triumphs, and where wealth was measured by the warmth of a neighbor help. And slowly, like streams joining to form a river, those principles spread outward, seeping into towns, cities, even across seas. But to the bluff, it was never about renown. It was about sitting shoulder to shoulder on long nights, sharing food, sharing work, and sharing the wisdom that wealth, real wealth, was not a solitary pursuit. It was the campfire glow in the eyes of a stranger, the echo of laughter in a home rebuilt, the peace of knowing that tomorrow burdens would be met not alone but together. And so the story of the bluff deepened, not in ledgers nor monuments, but in the living rhythm of generosity that turned survival into abundance, and abundance into legacy. As the seasons circled round again, Calder's Bluff entered a chapter few had expected. Prosperity had made the town more comfortable, and generosity had woven its folk into a tapestry of trust stronger than the oldest pines that crowned the ridges. Yet with prosperity often comes a new trial, the subtle danger of forgetting the struggle that birthed it. Samuel, now grayer and slower but still sharp of eye, sensed this creeping risk as he watched younger folk who had never known the hunger of earlier years. They laughed easily, worked diligently, and spoke of futures broader than any wagon road could reach. But he wondered if they grasped the roots that held them steady. One cool autumn night, when the fire hissed and a steady drizzle pattered against the cabin roof, Samuel called a gathering. Folks arrived with shawls over their shoulders, boots dripping on the floorboards, and mugs of steaming broth in their hands. Samuel leaned forward, elbows resting on knees, and began to tell them not of triumph but of temptation. "I've seen towns rise high," he said, his voice worn yet unshaken, "and I've seen them fall faster than a toppled oak. Not because the gold ran out or the soil grew tired, but because folks forgot the lessons that made them strong in the first place." His words struck with the weight of rain on old wood, steady and impossible to ignore. He spoke of a river settlement down south, once thriving with boats full of grain and timber. Wealth came quick, and so did pride. Instead of building together, each family walled itself off, seeking to outshine the next with grand homes and gaudy comforts. When floods came, those walls kept neighbors apart instead of bringing them together, and the town washed away not only in water but in spirit. That river folk thought themselves rich, Samuel finished, but they had no true wealth when the waters rose. The bluff listened with furrowed brows, the firelight catching the worry in their eyes. Clara, who had long carried the torch of learning, asked, "So what must we do, Samuel, to keep our roots strong?" He answered with a tale from his own youth, of the days when he had walked alone across states in search of work. "What kept me alive weren't the coins I carried, it was the kindness of strangers who had little but shared what they could. If we forget that kind of wealth, then all we've built here will crumble when the winds shift." Those words settled in the hearts of the young ones who had never gone to bed with empty bellies. They began to see that their fireside comfort, their full harvest barns, their growing reputation, none of it was guaranteed. It was a fragile inheritance, carried not in vaults but in values. So the bluff took new measures to preserve those values. They began writing down their lessons, not in ledgers of numbers but in journals of stories. Each family contributed: Clara, with tales of teaching children to write their first letters; Marcus, with the story of rebuilding after loss; the blacksmith, with his reminder that strength without service was hollow. These journals were kept in a sturdy chest by the fire, opened each winter for readings, so no generation could claim ignorance of what had come before. Ezra, though older and quieter now, added one final story of his own, a warning cloaked in hope. He spoke of a dream where future children of the bluff traveled far across oceans, building lives in strange lands. In that dream they carried the firelight of the bluff within them, a light that guided strangers through dark times. "So long as we tend that flame," he murmured, "no flood, no famine, No forgetting can take it from us. This practice of passing wisdom like an heirloom became as essential as storing grain. Travelers who passed through often marveled that such a small town could speak with one voice about what mattered most. They carried the bluff teachings back to their cities, their ships, their homelands, where some listened and others scoffed, but the fire of the idea kept smoldering wherever it landed. As years wore on, Samuel's chair by the fire often sat empty, yet his words echoed whenever the journals were opened. The bluff had become more than a town, it was a living story, a reminder that finance, wealth, and survival were not cold calculations, but human endeavors bound by spirit and sacrifice. The campfire continued to glow on stormy nights, each crackle a reminder of past struggles, each flame a promise of resilience. And though time would eventually take the old voices one by one, their lessons stayed lit, like lanterns set along a never-ending trail. The journals grew heavier with each passing season, leather covers worn smooth by countless hands. They weren't written in fine calligraphy or bound with gold leaf, but in the sturdy scrawl of farmers, smiths, weavers, and teachers, words smudged with flour, ink splattered on from hurried quills, even fingerprints left behind by children learning to hold a pen. Each page was alive with stories that were part caution, part celebration, and entirely honest. The bluff had discovered a treasure greater than coin, memory preserved not for vanity, but for guidance. Whenever a new child turned 12, there was a small rite by the fire. The journals were opened, and that child was asked to add a story, not grand or mighty, but true. A lesson from tending animals, or from making a mistake, or from lending a hand to a neighbor. It taught the young ones early that wealth was not something only adults handled, nor was it a matter of age or title. Wealth was wisdom shared, a resource every hand could add to. One bitter winter storm, when wind rattled shutters and snow piled waist-high outside, the journals became more than history. They became survival. Food was scarce after a poor harvest, and the bluff faced choices between eating their seed grain or risking hunger until spring. Fear crackled in the air like the firewood on the hearth. Then Clara remembered an old passage penned by Ezra in the first book, detailing how a past winter had been survived by pooling resources and rationing with fairness. Reading those words aloud reminded the bluff that they had faced storms before and they had endured. Encouraged, they did the same again, and though the season tested them, no one was left to starve. It was then the journals became known not just as the chest of stories, but as the ledger of life, not for numbers, but for the accounting of lessons that held more value than coin. Outsiders, when they heard of this practice, laughed at first. What good is a chest of scribbles when the bank holds real wealth? They asked. Yet when their own fortunes faltered, many came to borrow the wisdom written there. In spring, a merchant from a distant river town arrived. He had lost nearly everything when floods ruined his trade routes. Skeptical but desperate, he asked if he might read from the chest. The bluff welcomed him, sat him by the fire, and let him open the books. Hours turned into days as he read about the rhythm of saving, the dangers of greed, the blessings of patience. When he finally closed the cover, tears streaked his weathered cheeks. "This is the only wealth no thief can steal," he whispered. He carried that thought back to his town, and slowly his people rebuilt with a focus not on riches, but on resilience. As word spread, travelers began coming not only to trade goods, but to trade stories. Some brought their own journals to copy lessons or leave their own. A mariner left a tale of surviving storms at sea, how careful rationing and crew unity made the difference between life and death. A wandering healer left notes about treating sickness with herbs when no medicine was to be found. These additions were accepted into the Bluff collection, binding far-off lands and foreign trials into the same fabric of wisdom. Samuel, before he passed, saw this with quiet pride. He had once feared that prosperity would soften the Bluff into forgetfulness. Instead, it had hardened them into guardians of wisdom, keepers of a flame meant not just for themselves, but for strangers as well. This, he said with a weak smile as he held one of the journals, is the true bank. Our dividends ain't measured in gold, but in the lives kept strong. The journals also reshaped how children learned. Where once arithmetic and letters filled the day, now lessons often began with a story from the chest. "What does this tale teach us?" Clara would ask her class. The children would raise hands, some saying it taught them patience, others fairness, others foresight. Then they would go about their lessons, but the weight of those answers hung in their minds, guiding even simple tasks. One summer evening, when twilight painted the hills in amber and violet, the bluff gathered for a festival. Music and laughter filled the air, but before the feast, the eldest child chosen that year read aloud from the journals. The story was about a mistake, the tale of a farmer who had once borrowed too much seed in hope of a bigger harvest, only to end up deeper in debt. The lesson was clear: ambition must be yoked to caution. As the child closed the journal, the whole town cheered, not in mockery of the mistake, but in honor of the honesty that turned failure into teaching. It became clear that wealth was no longer thought of as an individual possession in Calder's Bluff. Wealth was communal, carried in trust. The coins in one man's pocket were less important than the lessons in everyone's memory. Visitors often remarked that the Bluff seemed oddly immune to the corruption that plagued wealthier towns. There was no flaunting, no desperate one-upmanship. Comfort was present, yes, but so was humility. By then, the Bluff journals filled not just a chest, but a small library. New shelves were built from pine and oak, and the place smelled of smoke, leather, and ink. People began calling it the Hearth Library. To sit there in winter, listening to the fire crackle while the snow fell outside, was to feel wrapped in warmth deeper than blankets. Each visitor found some part of themselves in those pages, as though the ink held a mirror to their own trials and triumphs. And as the Bluff story stretched further into the world, one truth became unshakable. Money, land, and goods could be lost in a single turn of fate, but wisdom, once shared and remembered, became wealth eternal. The Bluff had turned survival into legacy, and in that legacy, even strangers found home. The Hearth Library soon became more than a sanctuary of wisdom. It grew into a beacon. Travelers who once passed through the Bluff only to barter now stayed longer, lingering in the library glow as though the shelves themselves whispered calm into restless hearts. Lantern lights shimmered off the polished wood of the cases, and on stormy nights when wind clawed at the shutters and rain drummed the roof, the library filled with quiet figures huddled around the fire. They came seeking something they could not weigh in scales or tally in ledgers. The Bluff welcomed them with patience. Clara grandchildren often acted as guides, handing out the volumes and listening as strangers recited their lessons aloud. One rule held firm: you did not merely read, you had to speak your understanding. This practice transformed each reading into dialogue as one person's insight nudged another memory or raised a new question. It wasn't rare to see a merchant from a distant city debating gently with a farmer daughter, both discovering truths neither could have reached alone. Over time, rival towns began to notice. A nearby settlement, richer in coin but poorer in spirit, sneered at first. "They waste hours in books while we build real fortune," their mayor scoffed. Yet whispers trickled in how Calder's Bluff people were less shaken by famine, how their trade grew steady even when markets faltered, how disputes among neighbors rarely turned violent. The Bluff's stability stirred both envy and curiosity. Soon emissaries arrived, cloaked not in pride but in quiet desperation. One delegation carried a tale of ruin their granaries had spoiled due to neglect, and debts mounted until families were forced to abandon their homes. They begged the Bluff for advice, offering coin in exchange. The Bluff elders refused payment. Instead, they offered the library and their time, asking only that those visitors take what they learned and sew it back home with honesty. And so, over evenings spent with fire crackling low, the journals were opened, and the emissaries copied lessons into their own books. They returned with more than they came for, a way to rebuild that didn't depend solely on luck or silver. It was this generosity that shifted the Bluff from being seen as a curiosity to becoming an example. Travelers began to carry copies of certain stories outward, sometimes written word for word, other times retold like parables. A peddler once spun the Bluff story of rationing through winter into a fireside tale in a faraway inn, and though names were changed, the lesson remained intact. Foresight and fairness preserved lives. In this way, the Bluff wealth spread unseen, not bound to one chest or town, but carried in voices across the land. Yet growth brought risk. A wealthy baron from the coast caught word of the Hearth Library and decided its contents would make a fine addition to his private collection. He sent agents under the guise of scholars to copy or even steal volumes. The Bluff, ever cautious, noticed their probing questions, the eagerness that lacked sincerity. One evening, Clara's great-grandson confronted them by the fire. "These books ain't treasures for the locking," he said firmly. "They're seeds. You take one to hoard, it dies in your hand. You plant it, it feeds you and your kin." The impostors left in silence, their plans foiled not by swords, but by the Bluff unyielding spirit of openness. The community began to inscribe a new practice into their journals, not only the recording of wisdom, but the guarding of its intent. Every page carried a reminder that knowledge was to be shared, not weaponized. This principle kept the Bluff safe from exploitation, even as its influence spread. It also sharpened the townsfolk understanding that wealth was as fragile as it was resilient. To protect it meant not walls or locks, but constant renewal, teaching, and trust. Among the growing collection, one new volume stood apart. It was bound in plain cloth, and instead of lessons, it contained questions. Each visitor was invited to add their own inquiry, something they did not yet understand or a struggle unresolved. Over years, the pages filled with queries both simple and profound. How do I forgive when trust is broken? How much should a man save before giving freely? Is courage the same as foolishness? The townsfolk called it the Book of Seeking. It reminded them that wealth was not certainty but curiosity, a willingness to admit what you do not know. One autumn, when leaves painted the hills in fire and gold, the Bluff held a gathering unlike any before. Strangers from 3 neighboring towns arrived, each bringing their own journals to place alongside the Bluff. The Hearth Library swelled with voices that night, sharing stories, failures, victories, and questions. Around the campfires, children from different lands played together, while elders compared scars and laughter. For the first time, the Bluff realized its ledger of life was no longer just its own, it was becoming the spine of a greater story, one that reached past borders and bloodlines. Through it all, the rain would still fall, the fire would still burn, and the journals kept growing heavier. Yet no matter how many shelves were built, or how many travelers came and went, the truth remained simple. Real wealth was never hoarded. It was lived, spoken, and passed on like fire from torch to torch. As the years drew long, Calder's Bluff began to see itself less as a single town and more as the root of a sprawling tree. Branches stretched into every valley and plain where their journals had traveled, and though storms bent some limbs, the trunk held firm. The Hearth Library had become known across the provinces, whispered in caravans and marketplaces as a place not of riches to seize, but of guidance to earn. What none outside truly grasped was that its real power lay not in its shelves, but in the people who carried its spirit wherever they went. The elders understood this and pressed for one final act of preservation, to gather all their wisdom into a form that even fire or flood could not destroy. Paper, though plentiful, was fragile. Binding could be torn, ink could fade. They turned to stonemasons, carpenters, and smiths, asking each to contribute their craft. Slowly, an archive unlike any other took shape beneath the town square. It wasn't grand in appearance, a simple stone hall with heavy beams overhead, but within, the walls themselves were etched with lessons. Not word for word, but distilled truths, short lines about fairness, patience, foresight, and trust, carved deep so no rain or hand could erase them. Children were brought there first, even before they could read, to feel the grooves of the stone under their fingertips. "These marks are your inheritance," parents told them. "When you cannot remember, the stone will." In this way, the Bluff bound its fortune not to coin or paper, but to memory carried by both flesh and earth. Yet the heart of the Bluff remained in practice, not preservation. Families kept living their stories, writing new pages. Some generations focused on trade, turning their surplus into connections that tied villages closer together. Others leaned toward learning, hosting gatherings where distant teachers came to swap methods of farming, building, or healing. There were setbacks too, harsh winters, failed crops, quarrels that tested their unity. But unlike many places where such trials bred ruin, the Bluff used them as fuel for its ledger. Failures became ink, not shame, and the stone hall echoed with reminders that hardship was a teacher in disguise. Travelers noticed the calm way the Bluff endured hardship. A peddler once remarked, "You folk walk through storms as if the rain was planned." An old carpenter replied with a chuckle, "We don't plan the rain, friend, we just keep our roof mended." That sort of wisdom, plain yet unshakable, became the Bluff reputation. It wasn't brilliance or cunning that drew others, it was their stubborn, quiet consistency. One particularly brutal winter tested them harder than any before. Snow-buried paths, livestock perished, and stores dwindled faster than they'd hoped. Neighbors in less prepared villages arrived desperate for aid. The bluff could have turned inward, hoarding what little they had, but they chose differently. Rations were cut evenly, and outsiders were welcome to share fires. Hunger gnawed, yet no one was left alone. When spring finally broke, though many were leaner and weaker, none had died. That survival, achieved through sacrifice and trust, became legend. Outsiders carried it like gospel, that the bluff wealth wasn't its stores, but its willingness to bear weight together. As decades passed, leaders from other towns began sending their youth to study in Calder's Bluff, not for arithmetic or letters alone, but to live among the people and see how they handled both feast and famine. The bluff didn't claim to be a school, yet it became one. Apprenticeships bloomed in kitchens, fields, and workshops, where the unspoken curriculum was balanced between saving and sharing, ambition and humility, security and generosity. It was during this time that a farmer grandson, Eli, began to dream larger than most. Watching travelers leave with copies of their journals, he wondered how far the bluff fire could reach. Could it cross seas? Could it live in places where the tongue was different, where the customs bore no resemblance to theirs? He petitioned the elders to let him take the book of seeking on a journey beyond the borders. At first, they refused. It felt wrong to risk their most vulnerable record. But Eli argued gently, "What good is a book of questions if it never finds new voices to ask them?" They relented, and Eli set out with a caravan bound for the coast. His travels were not without hardship: storms at sea, suspicion in strange ports, hunger in foreign lands, but everywhere he went, he asked the same of those he met: "What truth do you seek but have not found?" The answers filled page after page, swelling the book beyond anything it had once held. When Eli finally returned years later, his hair streaked with gray, the bluff gathered in awe. He placed the worn volume upon the stone table of the hall, its pages brimming with questions scrawled in dozens of hands and languages. It was no longer the bluff book alone, it had become the world mirror. That night, as rain pattered steady on the rooftops and flames flickered low in the hearth, the people sat in silence, thumbing through the questions. They realized something profound. Their ledger of wealth had never been about answers at all, but about the courage to keep asking, to keep growing, to keep sharing even when the path ahead was fogged with uncertainty. So the bluff endured, not as a fortress of knowledge, but as a campfire by the roadside of history, always burning, always ready to warm the weary and remind them that fortune, at its deepest root, was simply the will to carry one another forward. Eli returned lit a spark that did not fade. His journey had proven that the bluff way of living could survive far from its soil, and soon others followed in his footsteps. Young women and men set out carrying nothing but a satchel of journals and a promise to bring back questions, not riches. They ventured into mountain passes, coastal harbors, and wide deserts, finding voices unlike their own, but bound by the same hunger to understand. The bluff became less a single place and more a living thread stitched through countless villages, stitched by curiosity and shared fire. What made this remarkable was how little the bluff sought to claim. Other towns might have called themselves rulers or teachers. The bluff preferred to call itself a guest. Its emissaries listened first, asked second, and wrote last. Where they traveled, they didn't erect monuments, but sat at tables, tended fires, and carried water like anyone else. And in that humility, they found doors open that wealth or power alone could never unlock. Back home, the bluff continued to grow, but not with the clamor of ambition. Houses expanded modestly, orchards ripened, and the hearth hall always had new carvings to etch. A rhythm of life pulsed steady. Mornings of labor, evenings of learning, nights of laughter around coals that never seemed to die down. When disputes arose, they were settled with patience, guided by the ledgers and the stone walls' reminders. Children grew not to seek fortune in coin first, but in the trust of their neighbors. And because of that, even when mistakes came, and they always came, the town bent but did not break. There was a mason named Rowan who began to gather stone fragments from demolished or weather-worn buildings. Instead of discarding them, he carved them into small tablets, each inscribed with a saying overheard in the square or fields. Patience grows bread, spend in line with the season. Kindness mends faster than coin. Over decades, these tablets filled carts and cupboards until visitors began asking for them as gifts. Soon the tokens traveled further than the ledgers, carried in pockets across regions. They became a sort of currency, though not one of value in trade, but of reminder in spirit. A farmer in another valley might pull a bluff token from his pocket on a cold morning and smile at its words, steadying himself against despair. But not every chapter was free of shadow. There were whispers in distant places that the bluff, calm way bred complacency, that a town so focused on patience could never defend itself against sharper, hungrier forces. One autumn, a band of opportunists rode in, believing the town ripe for plunder. They were met not with swords, but with silence. The townsfolk stood shoulder to shoulder in the square, unarmed save for their steady gazes. When the raiders demanded gold, the mayor simply replied, "We keep no vaults. Our wealth is in how we stand together. You cannot rob us of that." Confused and finding no easy prize, the raiders left as quickly as they came. Some say one of them later returned quietly, drawn by curiosity, to live among the bluff and learn what strength they had mistaken for weakness. This story spread, adding a new layer to the bluff legend that its greatest defense was unity, an unbroken circle no blade could cut. Outsiders who came looking for treasure often left carrying something richer, an idea, a way of seeing the world that gnawed at them long after they'd gone. As years tumbled into centuries, Chowder's Bluff became both a place and a story. Minstrels sang of its winters endured and its questions gathered from the corners of the world. Travelers repeated tales of its stone hall, where children traced wisdom with their fingers. Some told of Rowan tablets traded like blessings across lands. Others spoke of Eli Book of Seeking, heavier each time it returned home, sagging with questions yet unanswered. What the bluff itself treasured most, however, was not the legend but the living. Its people still tilled fields, baked bread, and mended boots. They still bickered over fences and laughed at harvest dances. The hearth still crackled every night, rain or shine. Wealth, they insisted, was not something to admire from afar but to practice near at hand. And so, while songs and whispers carried their name abroad, they kept their eyes steady on one another, knowing that fame without care meant nothing. It became tradition, once a generation, to gather in the square and read aloud the oldest entries of the ledgers. Some words were faded, some crude, but each was greeted with reverence. The audience would then add a new entry, not in ink but in chorus, shouting together what truth had carried them through their own time. The cry would echo into the hills, binding their present to the voices of the past, and with every shout, they reminded themselves that their wealth was not a finished tale, but a fire that needed tending, breath after breath. And still, by the time new wanderers arrived at the bluff, they always found the same sight, smoke rising from the chimneys, laughter threading through the alleys, and the campfire burning steady at the heart of town. A reminder that fortune, when carried with patience and shared with others, never truly goes out. The bluff legend deepened as generations stacked like stones in a wall, each holding its place while bearing the weight of those above. Children who once listened wide-eyed at the hearth grew into parents themselves, repeating the same words in tones softened by memory. Yet no matter how often the story was told, it never felt stale. Each retelling gathered a little more smoke from the fire, a little more rain from the roof, until the tale itself felt alive, changing with the seasons like the orchards on the hill. Visitors found it strange at first that a community so rooted in memory was never stiff. While their own towns froze old rules into iron laws, the bluff allowed theirs to bend. If a practice no longer served, it was tested, not clung to. The ledgers were not seen as commandments but as companions. When someone questioned an old entry, the townsfolk didn't hush them, they invited the challenge. That freedom, carried with humility, became as precious as any grain or stone they harvested. One spring, a woman named Marin arrived from the coast with nothing but a cloak and a satchel of dried sea herbs. Her village had been washed away in storms, and she wandered inland searching for steady ground. At the bluff, she found more than shelter. She began to share her herbs in the nightly stews, teaching which soothed the stomach and which healed the skin. The bluff took her knowledge in, not as novelty but as nourishment, weaving it into their own rhythm. In return, Marin learned the patience of planting grain and the joy of ledger nights where questions were passed like bread. She often said that while the sea took her first home, the hills gave her a second. The bluff was full of such exchanges. Every arrival brought a new thread, every departure left behind a stitch. Over time, the hearthstones grew warm not only with the fire, but with the weight of voices from far beyond the valley. The town wealth, measured in shared lives, made it more resilient than any fortress. For when hunger came, it was met with stored grain. When sorrow came, it was met with song. And when change came, it was met with open palms rather than closed fists. Even so, the bluff was not untouched by trial. There was a season when drought withered the fields and fear took root in the cracks. For the first time in memory, the granaries ran low, and the sound of arguments grew sharper than laughter. Yet even in those parched days, the fire still burned in the square. Each evening the people gathered, not to feast but simply to sit together, sharing thin bowls of stew and thicker words of comfort. They sang old hymns softer than usual but steady. When the rains finally returned, they didn't cheer for the skies alone but for the way they had endured. The drought had nearly broken them, but instead it bound them closer as iron strengthens in the forge. In the years that followed, travelers carried the drought story further than the Bluff Valley. They told of a town that survived not by hoarding but by sharing, not by shutting doors but by sitting shoulder to shoulder even when bowls were half empty. It inspired others, planting questions in the hearts of distant villages. What truly feeds us? What keeps us standing when the earth grows thin? Many tried to copy the Bluff, though most discovered it wasn't the rituals that mattered but the spirit behind them, the patient flame that had been tended for generations. By then, Rowan tablets were scattered like seeds across countless regions. Farmers hung them in barns, sailors tucked them in cabins, merchants carried them on long roads. They became a quiet reminder that wisdom could be small and portable, a fire you could hold in your palm. One tablet in particular read, "Wealth is the hand that steadies another." It was said to have stopped fights, begun friendships, and even saved a life when spoken aloud in despair. The Bluff itself never claimed ownership of these tokens. They saw them as gifts that had chosen to wander further than their makers. Late one autumn, as frost began to creep over the valley, the Bluff gathered again to add their generational chorus. Voices of children, parents, and elders rose together into the night. Some said the echo carried so far that travelers on the ridge stopped in their tracks, staring into the darkness as if they'd heard something not of this world. But those within the circle knew it was nothing mystical, only the sound of a town remembering who they were and promising to keep tending the flame a little longer. As the Bluff story spread further, whispers carried on winds and roads alike, a quiet magnet drawing seekers who longed for more than coins could ever grant. Merchants arrived, their purses heavy with silver but their hearts light as straw, asking how it was that a town with no towers or soldiers seemed to possess a strength wealth alone could not secure. Some stayed for days, others for weeks, yet all left with something richer than what they brought, a sense that fortune was not measured by what glittered, but by what endured. They returned to their bustling markets with new habits, pausing longer at the hearth, listening closer when voices softened, recording lessons in small notebooks as if they had caught a glimpse of treasure too precious to hoard. One trader, a man named Elric, came with skepticism painted on his face. He had seen 100 villages promise wisdom, only to find greedy chiefs hiding behind words. But on the Bluff, no chief waited, no throne stood, only the steady circle of townsfolk sharing food with him as though he had been born among them. On his second night, he was handed the spoon to stir the stew pot, and laughter rose when he clumsily spilled more on the ground than into bowls. "Every hand stirs here," someone told him, and the words burned into him deeper than any lecture. Elric returned to his city, abandoned the tally books that once consumed his days, and began hosting nightly meals for strangers. In time, his city too found itself transformed, not by decree but by the stubborn glow of kindness that would not fade. The Bluff never sought to teach. Its people simply lived as they always had, and in doing so they revealed truths others had forgotten. Their wealth lay in patience, their strength in trust, their legacy in humility. Even their children understood that to boast of fortune was to diminish it, as if naming the flame too loudly might snuff it out. They walked with heads level, hands open, never grasping so tightly that they crushed what they held. To the Bluff, every act of giving was not a loss but an expansion, a ripple joining the greater river. As decades passed, the Bluff grew not in size but in depth. Families still built modest cabins along the slope, each home carrying the same quiet welcome as the last. Yet the gathering swelled, drawing voices from faraway places. A sailor once sang a song from across the sea at the circle, his notes trembling but true. When he finished, silence fell like snow, and then, one by one, voices joined in, repeating the melody until it belonged to all. That song lingered in the Bluff for years, sung by children who had never seen the ocean, proof that even the farthest waters could flow into their hearth. The ledgers, once Rowan's solitary creation, became living archives. Elders added not just numbers but stories, weaving financial records with lines of gratitude, songs, and even jokes that had carried the town through hard winters. The books were not guarded in locked chests but kept on open shelves, ink smudged by countless hands. Any who wished could read them, and any who had something true to add could write. Outsiders found it odd that a community would lay bare its history so openly, yet the Bluff believed secrets weighed heavier than hunger. To them, honesty was the coin that kept every exchange fair. Through all the years, one truth never wavered.
The Bluff fortune was not in gold, not in land, not even in the full barns that marked bountiful seasons. Its fortune lay in its refusal to see wealth as a ladder to climb higher than another, but as a bridge stretched across divides. Each person was a plank in that bridge, weathered and worn, yet together forming a path wide enough for all. The glow of their fires, the harmony of their voices, and the open hands of their welcome, these were riches no storm could wash away. When night fell deepest and rain whispered against the shutters, the townsfolk would gather close, voices low, the fire painting their faces in amber. Stories old and new mingled until they were indistinguishable, each layered with the smoke of memory. Travelers who found themselves in the circle often spoke of a feeling impossible to name, a sense of standing not in a single moment, but in every moment that had ever been lived there. The Bluff was not just a place, it was continuity itself, an unbroken line of care drawn from past to present to future. And though the world beyond would continue to chase after crowns and coins, those who had once sat by the Bluff fire carried away something far greater, the knowledge that true wealth is not counted but kept alive, flame by flame, heart by heart. The Bluff rhythm of life, though modest to the eye, carried a heartbeat steady as the river that wound below its cliffs. Seasons changed with no rush, each marking time not with calendars or tallies, but with the simple turning of leaves, the shifting of winds, and the creak of boots on thawing soil. Each winter pressed the townsfolk close around their hearths. Each spring loosened laughter in fields where seeds were pressed into dark soil. Each summer bent their backs beneath long days of labor, and each autumn painted the hills in flame before gathering them back toward the warmth of the circle. Outsiders often remarked that the Bluff seemed caught outside of time, as though the world clamor stopped short of its borders. But the truth was simpler. The Bluff walked at the pace of breath and heartbeat, refusing to quicken for the sake of gain alone. One year, when storms came fierce and unrelenting, the river swelled past its banks, sweeping away fences and flattening gardens. Elsewhere, such ruin would have led to despair, yet here it brought a sharpening of resolve. Neighbors walked house to house, muddy and soaked, checking on one another before turning to the fields. Together they carved new channels, guided the water back into safer courses, and built dikes from stone and timber pulled from their own stores. Work sang through those days, voices lifted to keep step with shovels and hammers, laughter carrying even under gray skies. By the storm end, the Bluff was scarred but unbroken. And when the sun returned, it glistened on land reshaped not by disaster, but by the steady will of those who called it home. It was then that strangers wandering through marveled most. In their cities, disaster meant contracts, payments, debts, and rebuilding under the shadow of loss. Here, it meant a tightening of bonds, a reminder that no single hand bore the weight alone. The Bluff had no treasuries to drain, no bankers to appeal to. Its wealth was carried in the calluses of its people and the certainty that come fire or flood, they would meet it together. For many, this resilience seemed the truest form of fortune. It could not be stolen nor lost in trade, nor rust away in damp vaults. It was enduring, and it invited even outsiders to imagine what it might mean to belong. Among those outsiders was a young mason named Kellen. He had fled a city where his craft had been reduced to building facades meant to impress, hollow shells of stone built fast for merchants who measured artistry by the coin weight. On the Bluff, he found himself drawn into rebuilding washed-out bridges, not for wages but for gratitude and need. At first, he struggled with the notion of working without coin, but as the weeks passed, something inside him shifted. Here, every stone he placed was remembered, not bought. Every arch stood not as a monument to wealth, but as a path for children to cross. When the last bridge stood solid against the river flow, Kellen wept quietly, realizing it was the finest work of his life. He chose to remain, adding his craft to the Bluff legacy, finding in their way of life a wealth his city had promised but never delivered. The Bluff, for all its humility, was never without vision. It did not seek to remain untouched by the world, but neither did it chase after its glitter. Instead, it drew the world inward, softened it, reshaped it. Travelers left behind tokens of their own cultures, a song hummed into the air, a recipe folded into the communal pot, a phrase carried into children's play until it became their own. The Bluff did not absorb or consume these gifts, and it wove them into its fabric, allowing each thread to hold its own color while strengthening the whole. In time, the town was not just a meeting of neighbors, but a living archive of countless lives intersecting. Perhaps the most telling mark of its fortune was found not in the structures of wood or stone, nor in the records inked across its ledgers, but in its silences. When night deepened and the last of the fire glow sank into embers, there came a stillness that was not empty but full of trust, full of belonging, full of the unspoken knowledge that whatever the dawn brought, it would not be faced alone. It was in these silences, more than in feasts or festivals, that the Bluff revealed its truest wealth. Generations shifted, elders passing the circle's stories to younger voices who added their own. The Bluff remained steady, though never stagnant, a place where wealth meaning was not locked in vaults but breathed in lungs and spoken in laughter. And so it stood, year after year, storm after storm, visitor after visitor, proof that the richest treasures were not those sought in haste, but those tended in patience, slowly, steadily, like a fire that never died. The years carried Kellen deeper into the bluff rhythm until he was no longer seen as the wandering mason who had come by chance, but as a root sunk firmly in its soil. His bridges became landmarks, not because they dazzled with ornament or towered with grandeur, but because they endured. Each stone he laid was touched with the memory of the flood, of neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder against ruin, and so every arch spoke of resilience more loudly than words ever could. When children played along the riverbank, splashing under the arches he had built, Kellen often sat on the shore, hands folded, a smile flickering like sunlight off water. He would whisper that he had been paid in the only currency that mattered: trust. With time, Kellen began teaching the bluff young ones, passing to them not only the craft of stone but the philosophy that had reshaped him. A wall is nothing if it only stands tall, he would say, guiding their hands as they set mortar between stones. It must stand together, every piece leaning into the next, carrying weight as one. That how we build here, and that how we live. His words seeped into their bones, so that even those who never took up masonry carried the lesson into their weaving, their farming, their cooking, their laughter. The bluff in its quiet way raised generations with an understanding that wealth was not measured by solitary triumph, but by the strength of bonds that held under strain. It was during these years that the bluff reputation began to ripple outward in earnest. Travelers spoke of it not as a curiosity but as a place of substance, a living testament to a different kind of prosperity. Merchants passing through lingered longer than they planned, puzzled at first by the lack of bargaining and contracts, only to realize that trade here rested on something firmer than coin. It rested on honor. Coins did exchange hands, to be sure, but they were never the end of the story. A bag of grain carried with it the promise of aid in harvest. A carved tool carried the memory of the hands that shaped it. Strangers left feeling enriched, even if their purses felt no heavier. One such merchant, a man named Brannick, came with wagons of fine cloth dyed in colors that caught the sun like flame. He expected to sell quickly, to impress the bluff with what cities deemed luxury, yet he found few takers. The bluff admired his craft but asked simply, "What story does it tell?" Confused, he pressed for silver, but the villagers shook their heads gently. "A cloth without a story will warm shoulders," they said, "but it will not warm hearts." Brannick, stung at first, stayed longer than he planned, hoping to convince them. Instead, he found himself drawn to their fires, where neighbors recounted the flood, the harvests, the laughter that wound like threads through their days. By the time he left, Brannick's wagons were not empty but fuller than before, filled not with coin but with a new resolve. He began weaving the bluff tales into his work, stitching meaning into each cloth, and when he returned seasons later, the bluff welcomed his wares not as luxuries but as vessels of story. In this way, the bluff did not reject the outside world, it refined it. It taught those who came that wealth without meaning was thin as paper, but when tied to story, to trust, to community, it became durable. Word spread, and soon the bluff was whispered about in markets and inns far beyond the river bend, spoken of not with envy but with longing. Folks began to wonder whether such a place might hold answers to questions the wider world had forgotten to ask. As more people visited, Kellen felt both pride and worry. He had seen cities twist under the weight of ambition, seen how quickly the hunger for more could sour what was once sweet. One night, sitting by the fire, he voiced his concern to the circle. How do we welcome the world without being swallowed by it? The elders' faces lit by firelight listened long before answering. Finally, old Mara spoke, her voice rough as bark yet steady as bedrock. "We do as we've always done. We weave, but we do not unravel. Each new thread joins the tapestry, but the cloth remains the bluff fray. If we hold to our way, the world may touch us, but it cannot unmake us." Her words settled over them like a blanket, easing fears but not banishing vigilance. And so the bluff walked its line with care. Visitors were welcomed, their gifts embraced, but the heart of the place was guarded with quiet resolve. They did not chase fame, nor did they spurn it. They simply lived as they had, wealth defined by trust, labor, and love. Outsiders could take part, but they could not buy it, for it was never for sale. Years deepened into decades, fields gave forth their cycles, children grew into parents, and the bluff endured. Stone bridges stood firm against countless floods, their strength echoing the strength of the people who laid them. At times, new storms would come, famine nipping at harvest, sickness shadowing homes, but never did the bluff break. For every trial, the answer was the same: together. And each time they rose stronger than before, their story grew, carried farther by those who had once only passed through.
When Kellen's hands grew stiff with age, the young ones begged him to rest, but he would not. "A mason never lays his last stone," he said with a grin. "He only sets it down for another to lift." And so he guided their hands until the day came when his voice fell silent. The bluff mourned him, not with weeping alone, but with labor. They built one last bridge in his honor, a simple span of stone crossing a quiet stream. It bore no plaque, no carved letters, only the memory of the man who had taught them that true wealth lies not in what one builds alone, but in what endures together. The bridge still stands, smooth with the touch of countless hands, a reminder to each who crosses that fortune is not counted in coins, but in connections that last beyond a lifetime. And the bluff, steady and unbroken, continues to glow, not with neon or gold, but with the steady firelight of lives intertwined. The years after Kellen's passing were marked by a quiet shift. Though the bluff itself seemed unchanged to the casual eye, the stone bridges still carried their weight, the hearth still glowed against the night, and the fields swayed with their patient rhythm. Yet in the marrow of the village, a new resolve stirred. The elders whispered often of how memory must not be left to wither in the hearts of the old. "A story untold is a fire left to die," Mara said one evening, her eyes dim yet fierce. So it was that the bluff began to weave its history not only into the work of hands, but into words, songs, and symbols. They gathered by firelight to share, children pressing close as voices told of floods endured, neighbors uplifted, wealth measured in trust. From these nights grew a tradition of remembrance, so that no one would forget how the bluff had been shaped. The custom became so treasured that even travelers who passed through were invited to sit and listen. Some laughed at the simplicity of it, but most left with something heavy and new carried within them. In markets far from the bluff, one could sometimes hear a merchant retelling those stories with clumsy reverence, their voices softened as if they spoke of sacred things. And slowly, the bluff name spread not just as a place of prosperity, but as a kind of hearth in the imagination of strangers, an unseen fire that warmed even those far away. This reputation drew seekers, though not all came with good hearts. Among the wanderers was a man called Oric, his pockets jangling with coin from ventures in cities where profit trumped people. He had heard of the bluff's curious wealth, and suspicion gnawed at him. "No place grows rich without silver," he muttered as he came down the winding path, "and if silver there be, I'll find it." His eyes, sharp as knives, searched for vaults, ledgers, or stores of treasure. What he found unsettled him. Bridges tended with care, homes that welcomed him without question, and children who carried trust in their eyes. He tried to buy, to bargain, to bend their ways toward greed, but the bluff only smiled gently, declining without hostility. Frustration burned in Oric. One night he sat by their fire, unable to contain his anger. "Where is it?" he demanded, startling the circle. "Where is the wealth you hide? Where are the coffers that make this place so steady?" The fire crackled, and silence fell heavy. At last, young Elia, a girl with hands still raw from learning to set stone, lifted her chin. "You sit on it," she said plainly. "This fire, these voices, this trust, that our wealth. You cannot count it with coins." Her words stung like frost, for they were delivered without spite, only truth. Oric left before dawn, but not with victory. The bluff had given him no gold, yet it had unsettled the foundation of all he thought he knew. Months later, rumor came back of him. Oric had not returned to his old dealings. Instead, he had begun tending land by his own hand, living quieter, slower, as though haunted by what he had witnessed. Some said he never fully found peace, forever torn between the man he had been and the glimpse of something better. Yet even in his struggle, the bluff had planted a seed, and that was often how its wealth spread, not with conquest or conversion, but with seeds sown in unwilling soil, waiting for their season to grow. Meanwhile, the bluff itself flourished not by expansion, but by deepening. They built not more bridges, but stronger ones, not more homes, but warmer ones. Their gatherings grew longer, their songs richer, their trust thicker. Young ones carried the stories forward, shaping them in ways the old never imagined. One carved the flood tale into wood, another painted the bridges in colors that seemed to glow even in dusk. Another set the lessons into verse that carried easily on the lips of farmers and merchants alike. Each act was not an addition to wealth, but a renewal of it, ensuring that the core never faded. Strangers often asked why the bluff never sought to build walls, to guard its treasure from envious eyes. The answer was simple, though it baffled many. A wall keeps out more than it keeps safe. We trust the world enough to welcome it. If trust fails us, then so be it. But until then, we will not live in fear. And so they remained open, and in that openness their strength only grew. For those who came with malice rarely found what they sought, and those who came with curiosity often left changed. As generations rolled on, the Bluff story became less about a single flood or a single mason and more about an enduring way of life. It was no longer just survival that defined them, but resilience woven into joy, trust carried into every season, memory passed like an heirloom. Kellen bridges remained not just as stone, but as metaphors etched into every corner of the bluff. And though time weathered all things, their wealth endured, precisely because it was never stored in vaults, but in the living, breathing fabric of community. Seasons folded into years, and the bluff found itself in a rhythm so steady it almost sang. The children who once huddled by the fire with wide eyes grew into men and women who carried tools, led songs, and taught lessons of their own. They had not forgotten what Mara, Elia, or Kellen had whispered into the air all those nights before. In their voices lived the cadence of continuity, the kind that told the listener that no moment stands alone. It is always stitched to what came before and what will follow. The valley itself seemed to notice. Storms still came, and winters could still grip the land with sharp teeth, but each hardship met a community ready to bend without breaking. When the crops failed one autumn, they did not despair. Instead, they gathered at the hearth, pooled what little they had, and leaned on neighboring towns in exchange for songs, work, or promises. In time, when their own fields turned gold again, they gave back double without hesitation, and thus even hardship became another stone in their invisible wealth. It was during one such lean season that a traveler named Halden arrived. He was no Auric, gnawed by greed rather. He was weary with disappointment. He had spent half his life chasing a dream of prosperity in the cities, working hands raw for men who promised him gain and left him empty-handed. His face bore the marks of bitterness, and his eyes were like wells that had gone dry. When he first stepped into the bluff, he scoffed at their laughter, their open doors, their fire-lit evenings. "How can you sing when your stores are nearly bare?" he muttered under his breath. But unlike the city folk he had known, no one argued or mocked him for his bitterness. Instead, a family he had never met offered him a seat at their table, and though the stew was thin, they ladled it with a smile as though it were feast enough. Halden sat stiff, waiting for the catch, the debt, the price. None came. Night after night, he was welcomed without question, and slowly the iron bands around his chest began to loosen. One evening, a boy no older than 12 handed him a small loaf of bread baked from the last of the family flour. Halden tried to refuse, shame prickling hot under his skin, but the boy pushed it into his hands with a grin. "Take it. Tomorrow will bring more." Halden's throat tightened, for he had lived too long in places where tomorrow was a thing to fear, not a promise to lean upon. That simple act cracked something in him, and tears came unbidden, falling into the firelight where no one mocked them. Over the months, Halden stayed. He learned not only to receive but to give, and in giving, he rediscovered pieces of himself he had thought lost forever. His hands, once calloused from toil for others, now built for neighbors who worked beside him. His voice, once sharp with cynicism, began to soften as he sang with the others. He did not become a leader, nor did he need to. It was enough that he became part of the weave, another thread in the fabric of trust. Halden's story spread far beyond him, for he began to write letters to those he had left behind in the city. He told of nights where a simple fire warmed more than any gold, of fields where shared labor bore more fruit than any solitary wealth. Some dismissed his words, thinking him mad or bewitched, yet a few listened. And from those few, more came, some broken, some hopeful, all curious about this place where prosperity was measured in the strength of one neighbor hand. The bluff never advertised itself, never proclaimed greatness. Yet it grew in influence not by force, but by the quiet power of lives altered. In far-off towns, when merchants spoke of honest trade, they called it bluff style. When neighbors pooled coins to help another rebuild after fire, they said, "It is the bluff way." The name became shorthand for trust itself, and though some tried to twist it, most carried it with reverence. Years turned again, and with them came generations who had never seen the first flood, who never heard Kellen's voice. Yet in their bones they carried the truth of those days, because their parents had sung it, their grandparents had lived it, and their community had enshrined it. What had begun as survival had become tradition, and what had become tradition had blossomed into identity. As one elder remarked in his twilight years, sitting by the fire as rain pattered against the earth, "We are wealthy not because we hold riches, but because riches cannot hold us. Our wealth lives here." He tapped his chest, then spread his hand to the circle around him, and here, so long as it is shared,
it will never diminish. And the firelight danced on every face, making it seem as though each soul glowed with its own ember of that wealth. The bluff endured, not by conquest, not by cunning, but by holding to the simplest of truths, that shared trust outlasts fortune, and that true prosperity is measured in the way a people weather life together. And so, its story carried on, not carved in stone or guarded by walls, but alive, breathing, and eternal, like the fire at its heart. Winds of change do not ask permission before they blow, and in time, the bluff felt the stir of greater forces beyond its valley. Trade routes shifted, new settlements rose nearby, and with them came travelers carrying both opportunity and temptation. Wagons rattled down the dirt paths more frequently now, bearing trinkets, fabrics, metals, and ideas. With each arrival came the same questions whispered around the fire. Shall we take what is offered, or shall we guard what we have built? Unlike other towns that leapt headlong at the shine of novelty, the bluff weighed carefully. Their wealth was not in baubles, but in balance. Still, there were things worth embracing, books with strange letters that broadened the minds of their children, tools forged sharper than any they had known, instruments that carried new songs into the night. Yet for every gift, they asked, does this strengthen the circle, or does it break it? If it threatened to make one man rise too high above his neighbor, they set it aside. If it fed the hearth of all, they welcomed it gladly. It was during this turning that Halden, once the weary traveler, found his voice strongest. He reminded the people of how he had come hollow and had been filled, not by treasures, but by the steady hand of trust. He warned gently that even small cracks of envy could widen into gulfs, and because he had once been the bitter outsider, his words carried weight no lecture could match. He stood as proof of the bluff wealth, living evidence that their way transformed more than fortunes, it healed souls. The years pressed on, and beyond the valley, whispers grew into talk. In the cities, merchants argued over how the bluff could thrive without minted coin or a barren decree. Scholars scribbled notes, marveling that a community could flourish with no contracts sealed in ink, only promises sealed in handshakes. Some scoffed, claiming it a tale exaggerated by romantics. Others rode the winding roads just to see with their own eyes. And those who stayed long enough to feel the rhythm of hearth and field found themselves softened, as Halden once was. Yet with fame came danger. One autumn, a caravan arrived bearing a wealthy trader named Garin, whose eyes glittered with calculation. He spoke smooth words of partnership, offering to funnel riches into the bluff in exchange for exclusive trade rights. On the surface, his offer seemed generous: grain for coins, wood for silver, crafts for gold. But behind his polished tone was the same hunger that had consumed men like Auric generations before. Garin sought to turn the bluff into a ledger entry, its people into laborers for his own ascent. The council gathered that night in the firelit hall. Flames cracked, rain drummed on the roof, and the air was heavy with unease. Some argued that Garin wealth could shield them from lean winters. Others feared it would enslave them to his ledger. For hours they spoke, voices weaving through memory and hope. Then at last, Halden rose, his hair silver, his frame stooped, but his voice steady as ever. I once chased the shine of gold, he said. It left me empty. I once came here hollow, and I was filled not by coins, but by care. Ask yourselves, friends, do you want wealth that chains us, or wealth that frees us? Silence fell, and in that silence the people remembered. They remembered the flood, the famine, the shared bread, the boy's simple words, tomorrow will bring more. And so they declined Garin's offer. The trader left, lips tight, eyes hard, muttering of fools. But the bluff breathed easier, for it had faced temptation and chosen rightly. From that night forward, a saying took root among them: not all gold is gained, not all silver shines. It passed from tongue to tongue, etched not on parchment but in memory, serving as both warning and compass. Children grew hearing it at bedtime, merchants heard it at the gate, and elders whispered it with a knowing smile when temptation arose. The bluff did not stand apart from the world it flowed with it, yet it carried within a core that no storm or bribe could erode. Its wealth was measured in the warmth of its fires, the strength of its songs, the resilience of its circle. And though the world beyond twisted with wars, greed, and fleeting empires, the bluff endured, glowing like a lantern in the dark, drawing souls who longed for more than fleeting fortune. And when strangers asked how they had managed such prosperity, the answer was always the same, simple and unadorned. We trust, we share, we endure. Seasons rolled on, and with them came the ever-turning wheel of planting, harvest, rest, and renewal. Children who once darted between the cabins of the bluff with wooden toys grew into men and women who bore plows, hammers, and the quiet responsibility of care. What was once a handful of households had swelled into dozens, yet the air of the village remained unchanged, a place where no door was locked, no fire burned alone. Travelers still arrived, dusty and weary, and they were met with the same mixture of curiosity and welcome that Halden himself had once known. The bluff, without ever seeking it, had become a beacon to those adrift. What set it apart was not grandeur, but steadiness. Where other settlements built towering halls or sought to stamp their names into history with stone and steel, the bluff built something softer yet stronger, a culture of remembrance. Each harvest, a portion was set aside, not only for lean winters, but as an offering to the memory of all who had kept the circle unbroken. These stores bore no owner mark, they were entrusted to the community itself, and none would dare betray that trust. And when newcomers tried to press their claim or to take more than their share, they quickly found that the weight of the whole community bore down, not with violence, but with an unwavering refusal to let greed fester. As the bluff grew, so too did the stories. Old Halden, in the twilight of his years, became less a man than a living archive. Children gathered round his chair as the evening fire cast long shadows, and he told not tales of dragons or kings, but of simple bread shared in famine, of hands clasped in flood, of a boy promised that tomorrow would bring more. These stories were not fancies meant to entertain, they were lessons carved into the marrow of the bluff, reminders that prosperity was not something seized, but something nurtured. And so, when Halden's voice finally fell silent one winter night, the people mourned him as they might a father, but they carried his words like flint in their pockets, ready to spark whenever darkness pressed too close. Generations later, his name was still spoken with reverence. His likeness, carved by a humble craftsman, stood not in the square but beside the community hall, a place where decisions were made. There he was depicted not as a conqueror, nor as a man weighed with gold, but simply seated, his hand extended as if welcoming the next weary soul who stumbled into the bluff seeking rest. But time has a way of testing even the strongest legacies. Beyond the valley, kingdoms rose and fell, each claiming the mantle of permanence. Armies tramped the roads, banners fluttered above cities, and gold flooded in and out of coffers like restless tides. With these waves came pressures the bluff had never before faced. Tax collectors from distant lords knocked at their gates, demanding coin for wars the bluff had no part in. Some urged compliance, fearing the weight of swords. Others whispered of resistance, recalling that their wealth was not measured in coin. It was in these moments that the true strength of their heritage shone. Instead of bending wholly to the demand or bristling into defiance, the bluff responded in the only way it knew: together. They pooled resources, offering not coin alone, but goods of such quality and abundance that even the collectors were taken aback. Grain finer than the city stores, timber straight and sturdy, wool thick enough to outlast winters. These offerings, though humble in origin, carried with them the invisible weight of community. And so, more often than not, the collectors left baffled but satisfied, their ledgers marked with surplus, their hearts oddly softened by the place where wealth bore no master. Still, there were times when the bluff refusal to bow drew suspicion. A visiting magistrate once sneered that no community could thrive without secrets hidden in vaults or debts unpaid in back rooms. He accused them of trickery, of hiding some golden vein beneath their fields. Yet when he demanded proof, the people did not argue, they simply invited him to stay. Days turned into weeks, weeks into a season, and in time the magistrate himself began to soften. He saw that their wealth was indeed in plain sight, in the laughter of children, in the hands that tilled soil side by side, in the feasts where no man sat higher than another. When he finally departed, his sneer had vanished, replaced by a quiet respect he could not quite put into words. What the bluff taught, without proclamation or decree, was that wealth was not a thing to be mined, minted, or measured, but a way of being. And so its legend spread, not through parchment or heralds, but through the whispers of those who had felt its glow. A trader might carry its memory back to the city, telling of a place where promises were worth more than contracts. A soldier might recall a winter night when the bluff fed him though he bore the emblem of an enemy king. A scholar might scribble furiously by candlelight, frustrated that no formula could capture the alchemy of trust and endurance.
And while the world beyond churned with conquest and collapse, the bluff endured, a steady flame in the storm. Its people knew that storms would come, as they always had, but so long as they faced them side by side, so long as they remembered that true wealth was in the circle, no darkness could swallow them whole. In the years that followed, word of the bluff drifted far beyond its valley. Merchants traveling across kingdoms carried more than silks or spices, they carried tales. They spoke of a place where strangers were welcomed without suspicion, where a man's worth was measured by his word and his work, rather than his title or his coin. At first, these stories were dismissed as fanciful exaggerations, a traveler way of livening up a dull supper. But as more voices repeated them, a picture began to form, and curiosity spread like wildfire. People in distant taverns leaned close, wondering if such a place truly existed, a place where wealth was woven not from gold, but from trust. One autumn, a wealthy merchant named Darren found his way to the bluff. He was not poor, nor was he in need of bread or shelter. He came with wagons heavy laden with goods, silver weighing down his purse, and suspicion carved into every line of his face. Years of trade had taught him that men smiled while sharpening their knives, that every handshake hid a price. He expected to find the bluff no different, perhaps a clever illusion dressed in rustic charm. But what he found unsettled him more than deception ever could: honesty. When he tried to barter with the innkeeper, offering fine cloth for a night rest, the man waved him off with a chuckle and said, "You're coin no good here until you've shared your story. Then we'll see what's fair." Darren, unused to such terms, felt as if the ground itself had shifted beneath him. That night, seated before the fire with strangers who treated him as kin, he listened to laughter ripple through the room like wind through wheat. For the first time in years, he ate without suspicion, drank without calculation, and when he rose to leave, he realized he had not counted the cost. Darren stayed for weeks, then months. He studied the bluff the way he once studied ledgers and contracts, searching for the trick that made it work. But there was no hidden ledger, no secret vault. There was only the simple, relentless act of people tending to one another. In time, something within him softened. When he finally left, he carried no sack of gold, but he carried something far rarer, the seed of trust. In the years that followed, his dealings across the cities changed. He honored his word even when it cost him. He forgave debts when famine struck. His rivals called him foolish, but strangely enough, his coffers grew fuller than theirs. Customers returned not because his prices were lowest, but because they trusted him. And when asked why, he always spoke of the bluff. Darren was not the only one changed. Others came, soldiers tired of endless campaigns, widows seeking shelter, scholars hunting for wisdom not bound in parchment. Each found in the bluff not riches to hoard, but a way of living that endured beyond its borders. Some stayed and became part of the circle, others left but carried the fire with them. Slowly, quietly, the bluff influence spread into corners of the world it had never seen. Still, the bluff itself remained humble. Its people never set out to be teachers or saints. They planted, harvested, laughed, and mourned as they always had. The measure of their wealth was not in influence, but in evenings when the fire crackled, children dozed in their parents' laps, and the circle held steady against the long night. Yet without intending, they became a compass for a world adrift. One winter, a caravan of traders arrived bearing gifts too grand for such a village: silks, jewels, even a gilded cask of wine. They wished to purchase secrets, to learn how the bluff prospered without kings or coin. The elders received them kindly, fed them well, and listened to their questions, but when pressed, they gave the only answer they had. There is no secret. We simply trust one another and keep the circle whole. The traders left unsatisfied, for they sought a formula they could sell, not a way of living that required surrender. Yet even they, as they rode away into the snow, could not shake the warmth of that fire or the echo of voices raised in laughter. So it was that the bluff wealth spread in ways no tally could measure. A widow in a distant town gave bread to her hungry neighbor, recalling the kindness she once knew there. A scholar penned treatises on communal trust, his words inspired by nights spent under its roofs. A child, now grown, taught her own children that wealth was not what filled a chest, but what filled a room with shared joy. Through it all, the bluff endured, not as a monument, not as a legend carved in stone, but as a living, breathing testament to the power of simple, steadfast trust. And though storms rose and kingdoms fell, though the world beyond often drowned itself in greed, The bluff fire never faltered. It burned steady, quiet, eternal, just as Haldon had promised long ago by the firelight. The years unfurled like pages turned by a steady hand, and the bluff lived on through them, neither rushing ahead nor falling behind. Its people marked time not by wars or kings, but by the rhythm of harvests, the laughter of children, the crackle of fire in the long winters. Yet the ripples of what they built reached farther than any of them might have guessed. Travelers still came, some with heavy burdens, some with empty hands, and some with hearts worn down by the weight of the world. They expected disappointment, for they had learned to expect little else. And yet, one by one, they found themselves surprised by the way the bluff held them, if only for a season. Men who had long since forgotten how to speak kindly learned again by listening at the tables. Women hardened by grief found that sorrow softened in the company of others who bore it alongside them. Even those who carried nothing but suspicion began to set it down like a pack too heavy to bear on tired shoulders. There was a smith named Geralt, who arrived with eyes dark from battles he'd fought and lost. He thought himself cursed, for every band he joined ended in ruin, every vow he made was broken. When he came to the bluff, he sought nothing but a place to rest before moving on again. Yet the villagers asked nothing of him, save to sit and share his tale. And when he did, halting and bitter as it was, they listened, not with pity, but with the quiet patience of those who know loss themselves. Weeks turned to months, and Geralt found his hands shaping iron again, though this time not for war. He made tools, hinges, small ornaments for children who giggled as they watched the sparks fly. He had never imagined such work could feel like healing, yet it did. By the time another band of mercenaries passed through, he no longer heard the call of their coin. His wealth was in the laughter echoing from his forge, in the steady rhythm of a hammer striking metal for life rather than death. Others carried the bluff outward. A young woman named Alara left with nothing but the memory of evenings by the fire, when stories circled as steady as the seasons. She settled in a port town far away, where sailors came and went without care for the lives they brushed past. But Alara opened a small inn and ran it in the bluff way. No guest was turned away without a meal, and no tale was too small to be heard. At first, she was mocked, her generosity mistaken for weakness. Yet soon, her tables were always full, and her name was spoken with respect. The inn became known not for the fineness of its rooms, but for the warmth within its walls, where men who spent their days at sea found something like home. When asked where she had learned such ways, she would smile and speak of a little valley village where trust was worth more than coin. The bluff itself never grew wealthy in the way the outside world measured wealth. There were no vaults, no great fleets of trade wagons, but when famine struck in neighboring lands, the bluff shared what it had without question, and when others marveled at their generosity, the villagers only shrugged. What good is full granary if your neighbor starves, they would say. Their richness was not in what they kept, but in what they gave away, and so their wealth never ran dry. There were, of course, storms, both of weather and of men. One harsh winter brought raiders down from the highlands, desperate and fierce. They came not to join the circle, but to break it, believing only in taking, yet even they were undone by the bluff's strange strength. For when they burst into the village and demanded grain, the villagers did not resist with blades, but met them with calm and open hands. "You're hungry," they said simply, "so are we, but sit with us, and we'll share what there is." The raiders, expecting fear, found themselves disarmed by generosity. A few left ashamed, but some stayed. And in time, even those who had once lived by violence learned another way, until their children could no longer believe their fathers had ever been otherwise. So the bluff endured, not by walls or armies, but by the quiet, stubborn insistence that wealth was not measured in coin. Those who lived there never sought to spread their story, never carved their names in stone, yet word traveled, as it always does when something true takes root. Across valleys and kingdoms, men and women spoke of a place where the fire never failed, where a stranger could sit and eat without fear, where wealth was not hoarded but shared. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest treasure of all, that the bluff needed no monument. Its legacy was carried in the hearts of those who passed through, who went on to kindle their own fires elsewhere, each one a small echo of that steady flame. And though centuries might pass, storms might rage, and the world might forget the names of those who first gathered in that circle, the truth of what they built remained, a wealth that no thief could steal, no storm could scatter, and no king could tax. The bluff rhythm slowed into something timeless, like a song that no longer needed a beginning or an end. Children who once played in its meadows grew into men and women who carried both memory and duty, knowing the fire was theirs to tend. The old ones, their hands lined and voices softened by years, sat near the flames and told stories that weren't quite history and weren't quite myth, but lived in the space between. And the young listened, not because they were commanded to, but because they wanted to carry the weight of it forward. There was a boy named Joran whose father had been one of the Highland raiders turned farmer. His bloodline bore the shadow of violence, and for a time he struggled with it, restless in a place so calm. He dreamed of distant lands, of coin earned quickly, of glory carved into stone. One spring he left, walking down the narrow path with his pack full of bread and smoked meat, promising to return rich and proud. Years passed before anyone saw him again. When at last he stumbled back, older and bent with burdens he could not shed, there was no scorn waiting for him, only the same fire, the same circle, the same quiet welcome. And in that warmth, Joran set down his shame and learned what his father had learned before him, that there was greater honor in holding a field steady than in holding a sword aloft. His wealth was not in the silver he brought back, which he gave away freely, but in the chance to be forgiven and begin again. Travelers often asked the bluff folk why they never built high walls or sought to guard their way of life with sharper tools. The answer was always the same, though spoken in 100 different ways. Because trust is the only wall we need. If we live with fear, we've already lost the wealth we guard. And though this puzzled men from cities where suspicion was bred into the stones themselves, it kept the bluff alive through seasons that might have crushed a harder land. It wasn't all ease, of course. There were harsh years when crops failed and snow came early, when bellies ached through the long nights. Yet even then, no one was left behind. Families shared until every hearth had at least a crust of bread, a cup of broth, a blanket spread across weary shoulders. Some nights, laughter rang louder simply because hunger sat beside it, and the people knew they could not let despair take root. Wealth, in those years, was not measured by full bellies, but by spirits unbroken, and that wealth endured. Word of the bluff spread farther still, whispered like a tale half believed. Merchants on their long roads told of it in hushed voices, as though speaking of something too rare to be common. A village where coin matters less than kindness, they'd say, shaking their heads. A place where a man might walk in empty and leave with more than he came. Many dismissed it as a fable, something to comfort weary hearts by the roadside. But some believed, and those who sought it, truly sought it, always seemed to find the narrow path winding through the hills, though no map marked it. The bluff's greatest wealth became invisible, the way it shaped those who carried its lessons outward. Generations of wanderers went back into the world bearing that quiet strength, and wherever they settled, they sowed the same seed. Inns that opened their doors freely, fields shared without tally, fires that welcomed the stranger as kin. These places never bore the bluff name, yet each was an echo of its song, proof that wealth, once lit, spreads like flame from hearth to hearth. By the time the old ones who first tended the fire had long since turned to dust, the bluff was less a place than a way of life. Still, the cabin doors creaked open to welcome the tired. Still, the circle of stones held its flames against the dark. And still, those who entered left changed, carrying with them a story they would tell by their own fires, in their own words. Perhaps that was the truest success of all, that the bluff did not keep its riches to itself, but scattered them like seeds, trusting the wind to carry them where they were needed most. And in the deep of winter, when the snow lay thick and the night pressed heavy, there were moments when you could swear you heard it. The faint laughter of those long gone, the rustle of hands passing bread, the steady murmur of voices weaving a story too vast to end. The bluff lived not only in the valley, but in every soul that remembered what it had shown. That wealth was not gold, nor land, nor power, but the warmth of a fire shared freely, burning bright enough to outlast the coldest night. The years gave the bluff a rhythm that felt older than stone, a hum beneath the soil that every child born there seemed to carry in their bones. Strangers who stumbled upon the valley often remarked on it, how even the wind through the trees seemed to move in time with some unseen heartbeat. They would sit by the fire on their first night, unsure, weary, measuring these quiet folk against the countless villages they had passed through. Yet by morning, their shoulders softened, their eyes warmed,
and without realizing it, they began to breathe in rhythm with the land. One such stranger was a woman named Elira, a trader from the southern roads. Her wagon was heavy with silks, spices, and trinkets that glittered in the lamplight. She had made her fortune through cunning, buying low where hunger pressed and selling high where desperation opened purses. Her tongue was sharp, her mind sharper, and in every town she passed through, she left richer than she arrived. But the bluff unsettled her. When she offered her goods, the folk did not haggle or clamor. They asked instead what she needed for her journey onward, what warmth or rest she desired before she set out again. At first, she thought them fools, simple folk blind to the worth of what she carried. But when her wagon wheel cracked on the northern slope, it was not her gold that drew help, but the quiet bond she had unknowingly stepped into. The men worked late into the evening to mend her wheel. Women brought broth steaming with herbs, pressing it into her hands. Children laughed as they played nearby, their joy unguarded. Not once did anyone ask her to pay. For the first time in years, Elira's clever tongue failed her. When she left, she did so lighter than she came, not because she had sold her goods, but because she had given them away. Silks became blankets for babes. Spices became feasts that drew laughter into the winter nights. Trinkets shone on shelves where they had no price tag, and in the giving, Elira found a wealth she could not tally. She returned many times thereafter, not as a trader but as kin, her wagon filled not with wares but with gifts freely offered. Another tale whispered often was of Taran, a man with calloused hands and a voice that carried like a river roar. He came seeking coin, driven by debts so deep they chained his every breath. He expected little from the bluff but perhaps a meal before moving on. Yet what he found was work, not toil for wages, but labor for belonging. He split wood beside the old men, plowed fields with the youth, and sang as he worked, his voice lifting the spirits of all around him. At first, he demanded payment. "My back is strong, my voice worth silver," he declared, but the bluff only smiled. "What you give here is already paid in full." Slowly, his anger eased, replaced by a strange quiet he had never known. When he finally left, it was not to chase coin, but to carry his voice into other towns, where he taught men that song could be wealth too. And those who listened swore they heard in his voice the echo of a fire burning in a far-off valley. The bluff did not change the world with grand armies or treasures. It changed the world with stories, small as seeds and just as stubborn. A traveler told of a place where no man went hungry. A merchant spoke of folk who shared without fear. A singer carried a song learned beneath the pines. And slowly, like ripples across still water, these stories softened hearts far from the valley. There came a time when the bluff faced its greatest test. A drought settled across the land, harsh and unrelenting. Crops withered in their fields, rivers shrank to thin trickles. In nearby villages, tempers flared, hoarding began, and fear clawed at the walls of every home. Many thought the bluff would fall then, undone by the same hunger that had broken others. But when their own fields grew brittle and the firewood stacks thinned, the folk did not close their doors. They opened them wider. Families moved in together, huddling for warmth. Broth was stretched thin, but bowls were never empty. Stories and songs filled the spaces where bread could not. And somehow, by choosing to share rather than clutch, they endured. Outsiders, drawn by rumor and desperation, came to the valley in that time. Some expected to be turned away, for what community could bear such weight, but none were refused. The fire circle grew crowded, the nights loud with voices, and though the food grew thinner still, the spirit of the bluff did not break. When at last the rains returned, painting the hills green once more, the valley rose not poorer but richer, for every stranger who had entered left with the fire warmth stitched into their soul. As generations passed, the bluff lessons spread far beyond its borders. In cities of stone and smoke, taverns took up its creed. No man leaves hungry, their signs declared. In villages scarred by feuds, elders pointed to the bluff as proof that peace was possible. Even in halls of power where coin and pride reigned, whispers of the bluff wealth stirred unease. For men who built empires on greed feared most the idea that wealth could be redefined. And yet, no matter how hard they tried, they could not stamp out the story. It lived on in song, in laughter, in the quiet kindness of a stranger who had once warmed their hands at a fire they could never forget. Perhaps that was the bluff's greatest triumph. Not that it endured, but that it could not be contained. Like embers caught on the wind, its wealth drifted far and wide, setting alight hearts that never knew its hills. And so long as a single flame was kindled in its spirit, the bluff remained alive, eternal as the stars overhead. The bluff influence reached farther than even its own folk could rightly imagine. In the great cities where stone towers clawed at the sky, whispers of its way of life began to unsettle the very roots of power. Markets still clanged with coins and voices still rose in endless bargaining, but every so often a merchant would pause and recall the tale of Elira the trader who had once turned her wares to gifts. A craftsman would lay aside a portion of his work for a widow without coin, mumbling something about how folk in the bluff never let anyone go without. These were small gestures at first, hidden behind pride, but like water trickling into stone, they wore new shapes into hard places.
One winter, a great famine struck the northern city of Draymond, where walls high as cliffs did little to keep out hunger. The rich retreated to their halls, hoarding what grain remained, while the poor clawed for scraps in alleys. Yet among them lived a mason who had once passed through the bluff on a summer journey. He remembered the firelight, the laughter that rose even in lean times, and the quiet certainty that no man should starve if another had a crust to spare. In his small quarter of the city, he set up a long table from planks of broken carts. Upon it, he laid what little bread and stew he could muster, calling neighbors to join him. At first, only a few came, suspicious and desperate, but word spread. The poor began bringing what they had: half a turnip, a crust of bread, a handful of dried beans. The table grew heavy, and for a week, the quarter endured. Soon, the fire spread, not in flame, but in spirit. More tables appeared in other streets. The city watched in wonder as folk discovered that though each man alone held little, together they had enough. The nobles of Draymond, hearing of this, scoffed. They muttered of foolishness, of charity that could not last. But it did last, for the memory of the bluff, carried in one mason heart, had sparked something greater than fear. When the famine broke, the city was not the same. A tradition was born every winter. A great table stretched through the square, where rich and poor alike laid food without price. Though the nobles grumbled, none dared end it, for the people themselves had claimed it as theirs. Further south, in lands hot and dry, a caravan master by the name of Shireen carried the bluff fire into the desert. She had once been stranded in the valley during a storm, her camels near spent and her goods nearly lost. She had been taken in, warmed, and fed without question. Years later, she found herself leading a line of desperate travelers across the burning sands when their water gave out. They looked to her for salvation, for she was known as one of the hardest traders in the wastes. Yet instead of bartering, she gave. She split her private water among them, taught them to share what remained rather than hoard, and reminded them that survival was not won through greed but through trust. Those travelers reached the far oasis alive, and they never forgot. From then on, her caravans carried more than wares, they carried a creed. The desert takes all who stand alone, she would say, but it spares those who endure together. Folk began to call her the keeper of the bluff, though she never spoke the valley name herself. Generations passed, yet always the story grew. Children of the bluff wandered wide, taking pieces of their home with them, some in song, some in custom, some in the quiet way they offered bread before asking a man name. They did not preach or demand. They simply lived as they had been taught, and the world around them shifted, slow but steady. But for all its outward ripples, the bluff itself remained humble. Fire still crackled in its circle, songs still wove through its nights, and children still ran wild through the meadows. Strangers continued to find their way there, drawn by rumor or desperation, and they were folded into its arms as though they had always belonged. There were lean years and plentiful years, storms that split roofs and seasons of golden harvest, yet always the heart of the bluff held steady. For its folk had long ago learned that true wealth was not measured by the coin in one hand, but by the strength of the fire that burned between them. Old Elira, gray and bent with age, often sat by the fire in her final years, her once sharp eyes softened by time. When asked by the children how she had first come to the bluff, she would smile and say, "I thought I was coming to sell, but what I found was something I could never buy." They would press her for tales of her travels, and she would tell them of deserts, of cities, of seas where ships sailed like mountains of wood. But always she ended with the same truth. None of it filled me the way this place did. None of it gave me more than this circle, this fire, this way of living. In that way, the bluff became more than a valley. It became a mirror held to the world, showing men and women what might be possible if they laid down fear and pride long enough to share. And though the world beyond still staggered with wars, with greed, with hunger, there were always pockets where the bluff lived on. A song hummed by a traveler on a dusty road, a table set in the square of a starving town.
a hand stretched out not to demand but to give. And so it is, my friend, that the Bluff story winds on, not bound by stone or soil, but by hearts willing to carry it. Its wealth cannot be stolen, cannot be hoarded, cannot be spent to dust. For it is wealth born of fire and laughter, of bread and trust, of strangers becoming kin. And that, more than any coin minted or jewel cut, is a wealth that endures forever. The Bluff story drifted like smoke on a steady wind, curling through the cracks of kingdoms and winding its way into the most unexpected corners. Yet even as it stretched across maps and memory, it remained, at its heart, a simple gathering place. One fire, one circle, one truth that had outlasted generations. Still, far beyond its quiet valley, its spirit began to shape the very bones of nations. In the kingdom of Harrowfen, a land of marshes and iron, the king once decreed that trade and tribute should flow only through his hand. Markets were chained by tax, and every loaf of bread carried a price too steep for the hungry. But one winter, a boy from the Bluff wandered into Harrowfen capital. He had no title, no purse, nothing but a pack of dried fruit and a song that spoke of firelight and shared meals. At first, folk ignored him. He sang in alleys and corners, by the riverside where smoke from smithies stained the air, but his tune clung to them like dew. He sang of tables where rich and poor sat side by side, of gifts given freely, of a wealth no crown could tax. The poor began humming it as they worked. The smiths tapped its rhythm on their anvils. Soon, it grew louder than the decrees nailed to city gates. When the king demanded silence, the song only swelled. Bread appeared in alleys hidden by neighbors who risked the lash to share. A fire circle was built in secret beneath the old stone bridge, where children, beggars, and even weary guards sat shoulder to shoulder. They called it the bridge fire, and though the king men tried to scatter it, it reappeared night after night, fed by the stubborn memory of the Bluff. In time, even nobles grew curious. One by one, cloaked and anonymous, they slipped into the circle and tasted the bread that was given without demand, and for some, it changed them forever. Far across the sea, in a city carved into cliffs above storming waves, merchants measured their worth by ships in silver. Contracts ruled every breath, and no word was trusted without a seal. Yet here, too, the Bluff way found root. A sailor named Corinne had once been caught in a gale and washed ashore in the valley. He remembered the hands that had pulled him from the river, the fire that had dried his bones, and the laughter that had made him feel, for the first time, more than just a man chasing coin. When he returned to his cliffside city, he carried the Bluff not in his pocket but in his heart. He opened a tavern where no prices were listed on the walls. Instead, patrons left what they could, and those with nothing left stories, songs, or their own hands to scrub the floors. Folk laughed at him, called him mad, swore he would go hungry within a year. But his tables were never empty. The hungry came first, then the weary, then even merchants who found they liked a place where no bargain was struck. His tavern became a harbor in a city ruled by contracts, and sailors began spreading word. There's a place on the cliffs where you pay what you will, but never more than you can. Thus the Bluff seeped into every shore, not by force but by firelight. It was not carried in banners or armies, but in memory, in song, in quiet hands offering bread. It grew not by decree but by need, for the world, weary of greed, grindstone, longed for a taste of something gentler. Yet for all this reach, the Bluff never grew proud. Those who still tended its fire did not count the tales told in their name, nor claim the customs birthed by their way. They simply lived, season by season, gathering wood, kneading bread, mending roofs, and opening their circle to whoever stumbled through. Travelers would tell them, your story is known across mountains, deserts, seas. Kings whisper of you, merchants curse you, children sing of you. And the Bluff folk would only shrug, for they knew their wealth was not in fame but in the warmth they felt when night fell and the fire lit their faces. On stormy nights, when rain lashed the roofs and thunder shook the valley, families would draw close to the fire. The elder voices would weave stories of old, of Elira, the trader who had found more in giving than in gold, of the mason who fed a city with a table of scraps, of the sailor who turned a tavern into a sanctuary. The children, wide-eyed, would ask, will they remember us too? And the elders would smile and say, if you share as they shared, then yes, though not your names perhaps, but the light you carry. And that is more lasting than stone or song. And so the Bluff endured, not as a monument but as a melody, one that could not be silenced, for it did not belong to any one voice. It was sung in kitchens, in caravans, in the quiet between storms. It echoed in markets where strangers gave instead of haggled, in deserts where water was passed hand to hand, in kingdoms where poor and rich broke bread side by side. It was not perfect, nor was the world free of hunger or cruelty. But wherever the Bluff memory touched, something shifted, even if only for a night, even if only for a meal. For true wealth, as the bluff had shown time and again, was not the kind locked in vaults or guarded by crowns. It was the wealth of fire and fellowship, of hands open and hearts unafraid. It was the wealth that turned strangers into kin and left none to walk the long road alone. And so long as fires burned, so long as folk gathered close against the dark, the bluff would live on, not in maps or ledgers, but in the quiet, unbreakable bonds between souls. The night sky stretched wide above the bluff, a dome of stars scattered like silver dust. The fire, burning steady at the Circle Heart, snapped and hissed as rain clouds teased the horizon, carrying with them that deep hush of storms yet to come. The folk sat shoulder to shoulder, old and young alike, their voices weaving stories that stretched further than any road. But beyond that night, far from the valley, the bluff's spirit moved in ways unseen, in the choices of men and women who had once warmed their hands at its flames. In a kingdom of glass towers and winding canals, a city famed for its wealth and cruelty, a banker named Tarin had grown hollow. He owned half the bridges that spanned the waters, collected tolls so steep that families drowned in debt before they could cross. His ledgers brimmed with ink and coin, yet his home was empty save for echoes. One spring, wearied by his own abundance, he disguised himself as a beggar and wandered the countryside. When he came upon the bluff, he was given bread without question, a seat without price. For days he said nothing, only listening to laughter unmeasured by coin, to tales shared freely as rainwater. When he finally left, he carried no bread in his pack, but his heart bore a wound he could not ignore. Back in the city of glass, Tarin shocked his peers. He abolished the tolls, tore pages from ledgers, and opened his mansions to the poor. His rivals sneered, saying he had lost his senses, but the people called him the keeper of bridges, for he had returned the crossings to all. And though he never spoke of the bluff by name, he left a candle burning at his window each night, a flame mirrored by thousands across the city until the canals gleamed like fire rivers in the dark. In the dry lands of the south, where sand stretched endless and water was worth more than gold, a caravan master named Yala bore the bluff teaching like a talisman. She had once stumbled upon the valley with cracked lips and dying camels, only to be revived by cool water and the Circle's patient hands. When she returned to her desert, she carried their kindness like an oath. She founded the wells of trust pools dug in places where caravans passed most perilously. No coin was asked for, no guards posted, water was free, left for any wanderer who needed it. Many warned that greed would spoil it, that raiders would drain the wells dry, but something strange happened. Those who drank felt compelled to refill. Travelers carried jars upon jars of water to the wells, offering back what they had taken. In time, the wells became shrines of sorts, proof that generosity could survive even where the sun burned hardest. And in a northern kingdom wrapped in snow, where nights lasted half the year, the bluff's memory found its way into a hall of warriors. They had long lived by plunder, measuring worth in raids and spoils. Yet one warrior, scarred and weary, had once been spared by a stranger at the bluff who offered him stew instead of a sword. When he returned to his frozen home, he gathered his clan and spoke not of conquest, but of firelight. He built a hall where no loot was displayed, only shared meals. At first his kin laughed, calling him weak, but hunger has a way of humbling even the proud. One winter, when storms cut off their raiding routes, they flocked to his hall, eating from his stores, surviving together. When spring broke, they carried the fire into their raids no more, but into their homes, where songs replaced war cries. The clan story changed, and with it their name. They called themselves the Keepers of Flame. The bluff itself remained unchanged, quiet and humble, its circle always open, its bread always rising. Travelers continued to wander in and out, some staying a season, others only a night. Many left thinking little of it, yet found themselves changed in small ways, speaking more gently to strangers, giving more freely to neighbors, or simply holding the memory of warmth when the world grew cold. Years later, scholars would argue about the bluff. Some claimed it never existed, that it was only a parable passed from mouth to mouth, shaped by need. Others insisted they had walked its valley, felt the fire warmth. Yet whether myth or truth, the bluff gift was undeniable.
The memory of the bluff had grown so wide and far that it came to shape choices made by folk who had never heard its name aloud. Across a great desert, where caravans stitched distant cities together like thread across endless dunes, there was a merchant named Harun. His wagons carried silks, spices, and gemstones, and by all accounts, he was wealthy beyond measure. Yet, unlike most traders, he had no guards, no soldiers with spears to ward off bandits. Instead, he carried a chest of charms, small discs of copper engraved with circles. Whenever his caravan stopped at an oasis, he would hand them freely to those who begged for water or food. In return, he asked for nothing, only saying, "Carry this forward." At first, His fellow merchants mocked him. Those charms will not shield you when knives gleam in the moonlight, they warned. But the years proved them wrong. Raiders who might have attacked his wagons would stop when they saw those charms tied to the harness of a camel or stitched into the hem of his cloak. He is of the circle, they whispered. He is one of the fire bearers. And they let him pass. Some even offered safe passage through treacherous dunes. His wealth grew not only in coin but in reputation, until one city proclaimed him the untouched. He never told them the truth, that his protection was no sorcery, but the quiet power of a story passed hand to hand like a torch. Far north, where fjords carved deep scars into the earth and seas raged like wild beasts, fishermen lived lives as harsh as the waves they battled. They carved boats out of pine, their knuckles scarred from salt and rope. In those parts, winters took more lives than wars. Yet among them rose a tradition. Every year when the first snow fell, families would place a lantern on their doorsteps. The flame meant any traveler could enter and share in the family meal. The poorest homes might serve only herring and rye, but it was given with sincerity. They never called it the bluff, for the word was foreign to their tongue. But when travelers asked where the custom came from, the elders shrugged and said, "It has always been so, long before memory." And so the bluff ember glowed quietly there, in lantern light against endless winter nights. In a mountain monastery high above the clouds, monks devoted themselves to silence. For decades, they believed enlightenment could be earned only through retreat, by turning away from the clamor of the world. Yet one day, a starving child stumbled through their gates, her lips blue with cold. Some among them wished to turn her away, believing it a test of their discipline. But an old monk remembered a story his grandmother told of a valley where no soul was denied. He broke the silence with a single act, lifting the child in his arms, feeding her rice from his own bowl. That moment shattered centuries of stillness. The monks began opening their gates, not just to the desperate, but to pilgrims, wanderers, and seekers. Their teachings grew richer with every soul they welcomed, until even emperors traveled to hear wisdom from those who had once hidden away. The monastery walls were said to hum with warmth, and though winds tore at the mountain peaks, the fires within never faltered. And so the bluff wealth was not silver piled in vaults, nor crowns studded with jewels. It was something less tangible but far more enduring, a current of generosity that flowed unseen, cutting through the bedrock of human nature. Each age added a stone to its invisible foundation. Each act, however small, strengthened the walls of that unseen valley. Yet, the bluff was not without challengers. There were those who tried to twist its name, to claim it as their own. In a kingdom ruled by a cruel baron, he declared himself keeper of the bluff, demanding tithes and offerings in exchange for fire blessing. His greed hollowed the words, and the people grew restless. But even in his tyranny, quiet acts of defiance bloomed. Families shared food in secret, whispering, "This is the true way." When the barren reign ended in flames, the bluff legacy endured untarnished, for no crown nor banner could own it. It belonged only to the people who lived it. Across centuries, in ports where ships groaned with cargo, in fields where farmers bent their backs to sow grain, in marketplaces filled with the noise of barter, the bluff flickered in countless forms. A baker leaving bread where beggars gathered, a sailor rescuing a rival shipwrecked at sea, a healer refusing payment from the poor. Each act seemed small, forgotten by history's scrolls, yet each was a spark added to a vast constellation of light. Travelers began to notice a strange phenomenon. No matter how far they roamed, whether among the spice-laden bazaars of the east, the snowbound villages of the north, or the desert shimmering with heat, there was always a place, however humble, where kindness lived like a hearth waiting to be stoked. It was as if the bluff was not one valley, but many, scattered like seeds across the earth, each unique, yet bound by the same thread, the belief that true wealth was not kept, but shared. And though no map could point to its location, the bluff remained, eternal as the stars. Whenever the world darkened with greed or war, someone, somewhere, would rekindle its fire, proving again that the richest legacy was not stone, nor coin, nor power, but the courage to give when it was hardest, and the wisdom to see wealth not in what one held, but in what one gave away. Through the turning of ages, the bluff spirit traveled like a melody sung in many tongues, never losing its tune though the words shifted. In the bustling streets of a city gilded with marble and brass, where philosophers debated in colonnades and merchants shouted from stalls, there came a time of plague. The sickness crept into homes rich and poor, sparing none. Fear spread faster than fever, and neighbors bolted their doors against one another. But on the outskirts, in the quarter where cobblers and potters lived, a woman named Thalia opened her courtyard each evening. There she laid out bowls of broth, not asking coin, not taking names. Those who came shared stories with their bread, tears with their laughter. The sick were carried into her home and given care, and though many passed, none passed alone. Scholars of the city scorned her, calling her reckless. Yet when the plague subsided, her quarter was the only place that still thrummed with joy. Traders spoke of it to caravans. Sailors carried the tale across seas, and soon people in distant ports lit candles on doorsteps at night, saying, "As in Thalia hearth, so in ours." None knew that in that simple act, the bluff had grown again, weaving itself into ritual. Elsewhere, on a frontier where forests pressed thick and rivers ran fast, settlers sought to tame the land with axe and plow. They built stockades against wolves and raised cabins in clusters for safety. Among them was a man named Ewan, who had nothing but his labor to give. He was strong, quiet, and quick to lend a hand in building barns or raising roofs. Yet when harvest came, his own fields were meager, his cupboards bare. Still, he did not keep to himself. When neighbors quarreled over boundary lines, he was the one who split his woodpile between them, saying, "Peace is worth more than timber." When a storm toppled trees and crushed wagons, he was first to cut the trunks aside. Years passed, and though Ewan owned little, he became the richest man in spirit. At his death, families gathered not to mourn but to celebrate, each placing a token on his grave, a spade, a loaf, a lantern. They said it was like burying wealth with a king. The bluff fire had walked beside him, though he never named it so. Even in courts where gold clinked in goblets and nobles feasted on roasted game, echoes of the bluff stirred. A young prince, son of a ruthless monarch, once wandered the kitchens disguised as a servant. There he saw cooks sneaking crusts of bread to urchins by the back door. Curious, he asked why they risked punishment. One replied, "Because hunger does not know rank, my lord." The words struck him like a bell. In time, when the crown fell to him, he was mocked as the beggar king for opening his palace gates during famine, turning the banquet hall into a shelter. Yet his reign endured as one of the most prosperous, for the people gave him loyalty that no coin could purchase. Later poets sang not of his conquests, but of how his hearth became the heart of the kingdom. Through centuries, there were always hands ready to pass the flame along. A caravan boy who once received bread at an oasis fire grew to be a merchant and made his own wagons into moving sanctuaries. A scribe, who was welcomed by monks with nothing but tea and silence, copied their teachings into scrolls that spoke of generosity more lasting than armies. A sailor, spared from drowning by strangers who knew not his tongue, carved symbols of waves and flames into his shipmast so his crew would never forget. Each was a link in a chain too vast for any one eye to see, but strong enough to bind generations together. And so, the bluff became less a place than a principle, a compass by which travelers of every kind could steer. Some called it luck, others divine favor, but those who had sat by a fire and felt hunger softened by kindness knew better. They knew wealth was a river, dammed, it grew stagnant, but shared, it flowed with power enough to carve valleys and nourish whole worlds. Still, now and again the world forgot. Empires rose in arrogance, hoarding all they could seize. Wars burned villages to ash, greed hardened hearts, and it seemed the bluff flame might flicker out, but always somewhere hidden, a candle remained. In the poorest alley, in the humblest hut, someone would remember that wealth is meant to move. They would feed a stranger, share a cloak, or spare a hand, and from that ember, fires rekindled, spreading faster than any plague or war could quench. The bluff was no fortress of stone, no vault of gold, no name etched into royal records. It was simpler, softer, stronger. It lived in stories whispered at hearthsides, in lanterns lit at dusk, in meals stretched to feed one more mouth. It was the unseen inheritance of countless souls, richer than any crown, steadier than any empire. And as long as there were hearts willing to give, the bluff would endure. Not as legend alone, but as a living truth, always waiting to be discovered again. In another age, far from the mountains where the first bluff had stood, there was a kingdom cradled between deserts and seas. Its wealth was famed across the world, caravans of spice and silk pouring through its gates. Yet in the heart of its capital, behind ornate walls and jeweled domes, there lived a man not of nobility but of humble craft, a glassmaker named Idris. His hands shaped fragile wonders from fire, vessels clear as frozen air, windows that caught the sun and scattered it like 1,000 stars. His work was desired by princes, but Idris kept his shop open to all. To the poor who came with only a coin, he gave small cups etched with blessings, whispering, "Drink water and remember you hold light." To the wealthy who bargained for extravagance, he offered simple designs, saying, "What is precious is not always ornate." When drought struck, the wells of the city dried and the fountains ceased their song. Fear spread quicker than thirst, and riots broke upon the gates of merchants hoarding water. Idris too had little, but he gathered every vessel he had blown and carried them into the public square. "Fill these," he said to the guards, "and let each family take one." The soldiers scoffed. What use was glass when no water flowed? Yet by chance, that very night, a caravan arrived from the coast, bearing skins of water as tribute to the king. With nowhere to store it, the officials turned to Idris' vessels. For days, his glass carried life from the fountains to the alleys. When the drought broke, no one forgot that light could quench thirst as surely as water. Idris returned to his furnace, but in secret, people began leaving gifts at his door, bread, cloth, coins, as if to say, "We saw the bluff fire in you." Generations later, across an ocean, a small island bore witness to another ember of the same spirit. The islanders were fisherfolk. Their wealth measured in nets, mended, and storms survived. One season, the sea grew cruel, swallowing boats and scattering families. Among those left behind was a woman named Iofe, whose husband and sons were lost. Alone, she could have withered in grief. Instead, she began walking the shoreline each dawn, gathering driftwood and wreckage. From the scraps, she built a great beacon atop the cliffs, a fire so high it could be seen miles away. For the living, she said, not the dead. The beacon burned night after night, guiding fishermen back to safety. Soon, no vessel was lost to the rocks. The islanders called her the Keeper, and when she passed, they swore never to let the beacon go dark. To this day, ships in those waters speak of a glow like a hearth on the horizon, and captains whisper thanks not to gods of sea or sky, but to the woman who chose light over sorrow. Far away again, in a city of steel and smoke where factories belched black clouds, another thread wove itself. A boy named Elias worked in those factories, a child bent over machines, his fingers raw from labor. He saved scraps of metal, not for sale but to shape into small toys, spinning tops, little birds that flapped with wire wings. He gave them to other children in the slums, saying, "Even a day in shadow should have a spark." One of those children years later became an inventor, remembering the joy in those scraps. He built machines not for war or wealth, but to clean the city's poisoned air and draw water from the very clouds. When praised, he said only, "I once held a bird that flew though it was only 10. Thus, even among soot and smoke, the bluff fire had glowed, quiet yet enduring. And through all these times and places, the fire was never the same shape twice. Sometimes it was bread passed hand to hand, sometimes a beacon flame against the sea, sometimes glass that held light or a toy that carried hope. But always, it bore the same truth. Wealth was not a hoard, but a current. It was the warmth that spread when one hand opened to another, the light that multiplied when shared. The bluff was not lost. It was simply hidden, waiting in ordinary hearts, in simple acts, in the courage to give. Even now, when towers of glass scrape the sky and numbers hum in machines faster than thought, the bluff lives on. It is there in the stranger who pays for another meal, in the neighbor who leaves food at a doorstep, in the nurse who works through the night though no one may ever know her name. The world may have changed its tools, its tongues, its trades, but not its truths. Around every campfire, whether of wood or wire, the same lesson can be heard. Fortune is fire, and fire is meant to burn for all. The tale rolls on like a slow river, carrying us forward into yet another age, where the great currents of wealth and giving found a vessel in the hands of one who never sought glory. In a port town built upon cliffs of white stone, sailors came and went, their pockets swelling with coin only to be emptied in taverns and gambling halls. Among them lived a young scribe named Jonah, who earned his living recording trade agreements, debts, and letters for those who could not read or write. His days were filled with ink stains and parchment, his nights with the sound of waves beating against the harbor walls. Though his trade was simple, Jonah had an eye for patterns. He saw how fortunes rose and fell, how gold passed like water through careless hands, how one man gained too often became another ruin. Instead of despairing, Jonah began to keep another ledger, not for merchants but for the poor. On scraps of paper he tracked which families lacked bread, which widows struggled to keep their roofs, which children had no shoes for the cold months. Then he quietly approached the sailors who had squandered their earnings. "Your wages are gone," he'd say, "but your honor is not. Put what little remains here." At first they laughed, dismissing the young man's book as folly. But one stormy winter, when ships lay moored and work ceased, it was Jonah Taylor's ledger that fed the hungry. From then on, men who lost at dice left a coin with him as if to reclaim some dignity. Over time, his ledger became so trusted that even ship captains contributed, seeing it as a safeguard for their crew's families. By the time Jonah's hair turned white, the harbor no longer spoke only of debts owed, but of debts forgiven. His book, fragile as paper yet firm as stone, kept the fire alive. From that coast, the story drifts inland to the far reaches of a dry plain where nomads wandered with their herds. Life there was harsh, rain rare, and hunger common. Among these tribes was a woman named Zahra, a healer of herbs and stories. She had no riches, no flock larger than a handful of goats, but her gift was memory. She remembered every child born, every old man tale, every time a well went dry. When disputes arose over pasture or water, Zahra was called to speak. She did not carry weapons, nor did she claim titles, but she held the trust of all. "This family gave their goats in the famine 3 winters ago," she'd remind. "This clan dug the well when others had none. Shall we not return what was given?" And so her words, rooted in fairness, guided tribes away from war and toward sharing. When she died, they did not bury her with treasures. They buried her under the wide sky, and for many years after, when rain finally fell, the nomads said, "Zahra has spoken." Her wealth was not in gold, but in the bonds she wove stronger than rope. Far to the north, in lands of endless pine and ice, another echo burned. Villages there survived by hunting and trapping, each winter a battle with death. A boy named Arvid grew up in those woods, small and frail, mocked for his weakness. But Arvid had a gift for listening, not just to people, but to the forest itself. He knew where the wolves roamed, where the river would freeze, where the elk would pass. When famine struck, he led hunters to game they would never have found. When storms broke roofs, he showed how to bind pine boughs tight so snow slid free. People began to follow him, though he never claimed to lead. One spring, when traders offered steel tools in exchange for furs, the villagers argued fiercely over who deserved the blades. Arvid took none for himself. Instead, he forged a rule: the first tool goes to the weakest, so they may stand the next to the widow, so she may work only then to the strong. By the time his hair grew silver, the people no longer thought of wealth as trophies, but as tools to be placed where they were needed most. Arvid's quiet strength turned survival into prosperity, and even long after, parents told children, "Remember the boy who gave before he took." And further still, across deserts where caravans shimmered like mirages, the fire found new shape. There rode a merchant named Samir, whose wagons carried silks dyed like dawn and spices rich as gold. But Samir's treasure was not in his wares, it was in his word. Traders swore that if Samir promised a measure, you could count on it without scales. When a caravan was lost to raiders, he alone repaid the losses, though no law bound him to. "My name is worth more than my goods," he said. Over decades, his honesty built a network wider than any empire. He could travel unguarded across hostile lands because his reputation was shield enough. When he died, no monument was raised, but across thousands of miles, men lifted cups and said, "To Samir, whose coin was trust." His wealth was a current, invisible but unstoppable, flowing in the faith of men who never met him. So it went, across seas and sands, through forests and plains. The bluff flame took many forms, never the same, yet always familiar. It was in glass that carried water, in beacons that guided sailors, in ledgers of mercy, in stories of fairness, in trust kept through generations. The world grew vast, but the fire never shrank, and those who carried it, whether scribe or healer, hunter or merchant, shared the same unspoken vow that fortune, like fire, belongs not to one hand but to all. The years turned into centuries, and yet the stories carried forward, passed in whispers and songs, in markets and in meadows, in hushed voices around cooking fires and shouted across crowded halls. The flame was never bound to a single place, nor chained to a single kind of people. It lived wherever hands found a way to give instead of take, wherever hearts found courage to trust the stranger, and wherever communities learned that wealth was not just measured in coin,
but in the strength of ties that held them together. From distant islands where fishermen carved canoes out of fallen trees, to the lofty mountains where shepherds guided their flocks along paths as old as stone, the essence of that flame shone clear. In one such island village there lived a fisherman named Mateo. His net was often ragged and his boat barely held together with tar and prayer, yet he always returned with enough to share. When storms struck and families feared the sea, Mateo braved the waters alone, casting his net wide not for himself but for his neighbors. In time, his hut became known as the house with two doors Pharaoh, one for him, one always open for others. Sailors traveling far remembered his kindness, and when they returned, they brought salt, grain, even wood for his failing boat. He never asked for it, but such was the weight of his giving that it circled back to him like the tides. His name lingered in lullabies long after his boat was gone. Further north, in valleys carved deep by glaciers, small towns huddled against endless winters. There, in the heart of one settlement, a blacksmith named Ilan built her forge not as a place of profit, but as a hearth for the whole village. When tools broke, she mended them without charge. When iron ran short, she melted her own wares to forge what was needed. And when a fire threatened to destroy the town, it was Ilan who kept the bellows roaring, shaping makeshift iron buckets to douse the flames. From then on, villagers said her forge was not made of brick and iron, but of the spirit that bound them all. They paid her not in coin but in loyalty, watching over her as fiercely as she watched over them. Ilan's wealth was never tallied, but her name remained etched in iron rings that still hung in their meeting hall long after her forge grew cold. Then came another tale of a wandering bard named Idris, who carried no riches, no tools, no storehouses. What he bore instead were words, verses spun in marketplaces, in lonely inns, on roads where soldiers marched and merchants bartered. His songs told of generosity and betrayal, of fortunes that swelled and vanished, of kindness that outlived kingdoms. In every town, Idris sang not of heroes or kings, but of ordinary folk who gave when they had little, who lifted others when they could barely stand. People wept at his ballads, and often they gave him bread or a place to sleep. Yet Idris always passed part of it along, feeding the beggar in the alley, sharing his cloak with a child shivering in the night. In this way, his songs lived truer than any scripture. Long after he was gone, his verses remained, whispered still by merchants and laborers alike, a reminder that wealth in words could mend what wealth in gold could not.
And so the fire continued its journey, not as one torch, but as countless sparks scattered across the earth. Some flared brightly for a season, others burned low and steady across lifetimes. Each bore the same truth, that fortune, when held close, withers like a flame denied air, but when given freely, grows into a fire that warms beyond the reach of one's own life. The people who bore it rarely thought themselves wealthy. In fact, many lived humbly, some even in hardship, but their wealth was carried forward in the lives they touched, in the chains of giving that stretched longer and farther than their own days. Even as empires rose and crumbled, as coins changed hands and crowns passed from head to head, the true wealth endured, hidden in the stories of fishermen, blacksmiths, wanderers, and scribes. It was never kept in vaults nor sealed in ledgers, but it outlasted kings and merchants alike. And each time it seemed the world grew too dark, too divided, the flame would flicker again in some quiet corner, in the heart of a healer, in the hands of a craftsman, in the voice of a child who remembered what their elders had said by firelight. Thus the story carries on, winding like a trail through mountains and seas, never ending, only changing shape. And still, wherever the night grows long and the rain falls steady, there are those who will gather near the glow of fire and whisper, "Wealth is not what you take, but what you leave behind." The desert carried its own version of the flame, though its sands buried more secrets than it revealed. Traders with camels wound their way through dunes where heat shimmered like a veil, their caravans heavy with silk, salt, and stories. Among them was a man named Samir, who owned no caravan of his own. Instead, he walked alongside, a hired hand who earned his keep guiding beasts and pouring water for weary travelers. But Samir carried something rarer than the frankincense they burned at night. He had a way of speaking that calmed disputes, that eased tensions before swords were drawn. When two merchants quarreled over routes, Samir listened patiently, then proposed a path that brought profit to both. When water ran short, he divided it with care, ensuring the weakest drank first. Over time, merchants realized it was not their goods alone that brought them safely across the desert, but the presence of the quiet man who had little more than patience and fairness to his name. When Samir passed on, the caravans built no tomb of stone. Instead, they spoke his name each time they poured water into a stranger hand, saying, "Drink, for Samir taught us there's always enough if you share." Far away, in forests where fog clung to the trees and rivers carved paths through the undergrowth, there lived a woman named Aino. She was a gatherer collecting herbs, roots, and berries. The people of her village often overlooked her, for she carried no sword, built no ships, commanded no fields. Yet when sickness struck and fear spread faster than the fever, it was Aino who moved from door to door with her satchel. She ground roots into poultices, brewed teas from leaves, whispered encouragement to the frightened. She asked no payment, though many tried to give it. Instead, she asked that those she healed look after one another when the time came. Seasons passed, and while wealthier families fled to safer lands, the village remained strong, bound by the web of care Aino had woven. When she died, they built no monument, but each spring the villagers gathered at the clearing where she had dried her herbs and lit a small fire. They called it the Hearth of Aino, a place where the living remembered that the simplest gifts often carried the greatest weight. In mountain passes where storms raged like beasts, there was a man known only as the Keeper. His hut sat at the narrowest bend of the trail, built of stone and wood worn smooth by years of snow. He charged no toll, though the path was treacherous and many owed him their lives. Instead, he offered soup from his pot, a blanket from his bench, and directions scrawled on bark. Travelers tried to pay him, but he always shook his head. "Carry it forward," he said. "You'll meet someone who needs it more than I do." When seasons turned and fewer travelers braved the high path, the hut crumbled. But his name lingered in journals of merchants and diaries of pilgrims, each recording the same. The Keeper asked for nothing but gave everything. His wealth lived not in coin but in footsteps carried safely through the storm. And still the stories moved, winding into cities where towers rose higher than trees, where streets hummed with trade and ambition. In one such city, a scribe named Leora worked by candlelight, copying letters for those who could not write. She charged little, sometimes nothing at all, and often added words of her own blessings for the newborn, encouragement for soldiers leaving for war, prayers for families torn apart. People came to her not only for her hand but for her heart. Letters she penned carried courage across battlefields and hope into prisons. One man sentenced to years of labor said it was Leora words smuggled into his chains that kept him alive. When she was gone, her desk remained, ink-stained and worn, a silent witness to the wealth she had given, wealth that required no coin, only compassion. Everywhere the flame appeared, it bore the same truth, though in new forms and new voices. It leapt from deserts to forests, from mountains to cities, carried by those who asked for little but left behind much. And though they never met, their stories connected like constellations across the night sky. Each star alone was small, but together they mapped a path, guiding generations forward. And so, under campfires, beneath rain, beside ocean waves, people told these tales again and again, until they became more than memory. They became a kind of compass. They pointed not toward riches buried in earth or locked behind gates, but toward the wealth that endured in every act of giving, every moment of kindness. And somewhere in that endless telling, the flame grew stronger, bright enough that even in the darkest valleys, travelers could still find their way. Beneath the endless stars of the savannah, there was a wanderer named Kojo. He owned no hut, tilled no field, and carried no possessions but a staff and a small leather pouch. He was not a wealthy man by any measure the world could see, yet his travels through countless villages left trails of wealth behind him. For Kojo's pouch was filled with stories his grandmother had whispered by the fire, tales gathered from hunters and healers, traders and thieves. He told them to children who huddled close, to elders who had forgotten how to smile, to strangers who needed a reason to trust one another. And with each telling, the stories bound people together. In villages split by quarrels, his tales softened hearts. In lonely corners, his words gave courage. When at last Kojo's staff broke and his steps grew too heavy, he lay down beneath a tree and whispered his final story into the wind. Villagers who found him days later buried him where he rested, and there they built a circle of stones. Each time travelers came through, they paused to share a story of their own. Thus, Kojo's wealth grew long after his body was gone, a fortune measured in the voices of generations. Across oceans and jagged coasts, another kind of wealth was being forged by a fisherman named Elias. The sea was his cradle and his adversary, a restless expanse that offered fish only to those willing to risk its wrath. For years, Elias worked alone, his boat small, his nets mended with care. Storms often took more than they gave, but Elias always returned with a few fish, enough to eat, enough to trade. One winter, when the sea froze in parts and boats lay stranded, Elias chose not to hoard his catch. Instead, he salted what little he had and shared it with families who had nothing left in their pots. The village, once a cluster of desperate, starving souls, found warmth in his generosity. Word of his choice spread beyond the shore, and sailors spoke his name in distant ports, saying, "Elias teaches that the sea belongs to no man alone." Years later, when the village thrived, they carved his likeness into the prow of their largest ship, not because he conquered the sea, but because he understood it was never his to conquer. High in the far north, where auroras shimmered like veils of fire across the night, there lived a seamstress named Solveig. She stitched garments from reindeer hide
dyed them with colors drawn from roots and berries. Her work was not the grand finery of kings, yet her people wore her coats when blizzards swept across the tundra, and her stitching kept them alive through endless nights of winter. Solveig charged fairly, though never much, and often asked for goods in trade instead of coin. One day, when a group of wanderers staggered into the village, half dead from frost, it was Solveig who clothed them in her warmest garments without asking a thing in return. Years later, one of those wanderers returned with wagons full of supplies, saying her kindness had saved him, and now he wished to return the wealth tenfold. But Solveig simply smiled and said, "You've already returned it. You survived, and survival is a gift that multiplies." When she passed, her loom was left untouched, its shuttle still mid-flight. People visited her empty home not to mourn, but to remember that true fortune is often hidden in threads of care. In cities of stone where towers brushed the sky and markets roared with the cry of merchants, there was a man called Matteo. He was no lord, no merchant prince, no scholar of renown. He was a mason, his hands scarred by years of chiseling stone. But Matteo carried a secret ambition. He believed walls could hold more than weight. They could hold hope. When he built arches for bridges, he carved small symbols hidden from plain sight: a bird taking flight, seeds sprouting, a rising sun. Travelers who noticed these marks found themselves inspired, believing the city itself whispered encouragement into their bones. Over decades, Matteo bridges carried generations across rivers. His walls shielded homes from storms. His arches framed doorways where countless families began new lives. He died without riches, yet when the city later rebuilt its grand cathedral, they carved his name into the cornerstone. And so his wealth was not gold nor land, but the unseen strength he gave to others who walked on stones he had shaped. From deserts to seas, from frozen tundra to cities of marble, the stories wove together, unseen threads forming a tapestry greater than any one life. These were not tales of men and women who gathered fortune to themselves, but of those who scattered it like seed, trusting that it would grow beyond their reach. And as each story passed into the next, it became clear that wealth was not something to be locked away, but something to be lived, shared in words, in bread, in garments, in stone. And those who lived this way found themselves remembered long after their voices faded, for their riches were written not in ledgers, but in the lives they touched. Beneath the wide skies of the plains there wandered a tinker named Alaric. He carried no more than a cart of broken odds and ends, bent nails, cracked mugs, rusted tools that others had cast aside. Folks often laughed when they saw him arrive in their towns, for what good could come of broken things? Yet Alaric had a gift for mending. He patched the cracked mugs with resin and gold, making them more beautiful than before. He reforged nails into delicate hinges, reshaped rusted blades into tools strong enough to work again. When he left a village, he always carried fewer items than when he arrived, but somehow left behind more value than he brought in. People began to say that Alaric saw worth where others saw ruin, that he could see futures in fragments. Over the years, the villages that welcomed him thrived. Tools lasted longer, houses stood stronger, and people learned to repair rather than discard. Alaric never built an empire, never commanded armies of workers, but he built resilience in hearts and homes. And when at last he passed on, they placed his cart in the village square, not as a relic of his trade, but as a reminder that wealth is found in restoring what is broken. Far across mountains veined with silver, there lived a quiet innkeeper named Mirabelle. Her inn was not grand, its beams leaned and its hearth was small, but it was always warm, and her food always tasted of comfort rather than finery. She charged little, often feeding travelers who had no coin at all. Merchants who stayed in her inn found themselves less wary of one another, and sometimes deals were struck by her fire that later grew into fortunes. Soldiers, wearied from war, drank her spiced tea and remembered that kindness was not lost in the world. Once, a scholar fleeing persecution found shelter under her roof, and the book he later wrote, inspired by nights at her fire, reshaped the laws of a kingdom. Mirabelle never sought to profit from such things. She only knew that strangers carried burdens, and her gift was to lighten them, if only for a night. When she grew old, travelers came not to rest but to see her, to thank her for what she had unknowingly given. Her inn collapsed after she was gone, yet people still built fires on its foundation, believing warmth lingered in the stones. There was a river trader named Tommaso who owned nothing but a battered barge and the songs he sang while steering it. He never hurried to sell his goods, never shouted over the cries of the marketplace. Instead, he sang stories of his journeys, songs of the high passes, of storms that battered his boat, of the people he met in distant lands. Buyers who came for cloth or spice often lingered for his songs, and soon his customers were not paying for wares alone, but for the moments of wonder he gave them. Children followed him from dock to dock, and other merchants cursed him at first, jealous of his charm. But over time they too softened.
joining their voices to his until the docks echoed not with quarrels but with harmony. Tommaso grew no richer in gold than any other trader, yet when he died, river towns held festivals in his honor. To this day, bargemen hum his melodies and trade flows with less bitterness because one man chose to make commerce sing. And in the desert lands where water was rarer than gold, there lived a woman named Samira. She was a weaver of mats and baskets, her craft plain and functional, yet she had a habit of leaving little pieces of her work along the caravan routes, woven mats at oases, baskets in the shade of cliffs. Travelers, parched and desperate, often found these gifts when they needed them most. They began to call her the unseen friend, for none ever caught her leaving the items, though everyone seemed to discover them. Over the years, caravans that passed through her town grew stronger and safer, knowing they would find what she had left behind. Traders spread her name across kingdoms, though she never sought fame. She continued to weave in silence, her hands steady, her heart content. When she passed away, caravans from hundreds of miles gathered at her home, piling baskets and mats until they formed a mountain. The desert winds scattered them in time, but her legacy endured in every journey made lighter by her quiet hands. Different as they were, these lives echoed the same truth, that fortune lies not in what is held tightly, but in what is given freely. Each of them, Alaric with his mending, Mirabelle with her hearth, Tommaso with his songs, Samira with her quiet gifts, planted seeds of wealth in unexpected places. And those seeds, watered by memory and gratitude, grew long after the givers were gone. In the highlands where mist rolled down the slopes like curtains of silver, a man named Corwin tended to bees. His hives were crude things at first, hollow logs covered in clay, and his neighbors mocked him, saying honey was too delicate a thing to waste one time on in such a harsh land. But Corwin knew patience. He learned the dances of the bees, the times they stirred, the flowers they favored when spring was short and summer fleeting. He harvested sparingly, never taking more than the hives could bear, and he traded jars of honey for tools, for bread, for seeds to plant. Over years, his honey became known for a sweetness unlike any other, infused with the wild herbs of the highlands. Pilgrims traveling across the mountain paths carried it home, and in time, kings requested it for their feasts. Corwin did not grow rich in palaces or fine silks, but he grew rich in friends, for his honey was always a gift as much as a trade. His wealth was the taste of patience shared, proof that something small could change the flavor of the world. Far away in a fishing village battered by relentless storms, a woman named Ira gathered driftwood that washed ashore. Others saw it as refuse, battered scraps unworthy of use, but she saw stories etched in every weathered grain. From these pieces she carved simple charms, boats, birds, stars, and gave them to children or sold them for a single coin. Travelers who carried her charms swore they brought good fortune, and soon sailors refused to depart without one. Over decades, her driftwood tokens spread across ports like whispers of hope. Mariners in distant lands spoke of the woman who gave storm-tossed wood new life, and those who survived wrecks swore it was her charms that steadied their courage. Though she remained in her small cottage by the sea, her work reached farther than any ship could sail. She left behind no gold, but every sailor tale of survival carried her name. In a bustling city where towers of stone clawed the sky, a tailor named Janek worked in an alley so narrow sunlight barely touched it. He stitched garments from remnants others threw away, a sleeve torn from a noble coat, a strip of velvet frayed at the edges, scraps of linen stained and forgotten. From these he fashioned patchwork cloaks, strange and colorful. At first only beggars wore them, grateful for warmth in the cold. But as the years passed, travelers began to prize Janek cloaks, for they bore the strength of many fabrics woven into one. Scholars wrapped themselves in his garments while studying late into the night. Merchants donned them as they crossed dangerous roads, and even nobles came to admire their uniqueness. Janek alley never grew brighter, but his craft lit the city with color, a reminder that beauty was not in perfection, but in what was saved from waste. Then there was Leora, who lived in the heart of a dry plain where crops failed more often than they thrived. She had no gift for farming, no land to her name, yet she collected seeds carried on the wind, dropped by birds, hidden in market refuse. She stored them in clay jars, labeling them by season and soil, by rain and drought. Neighbors often laughed at her obsession, but when famine struck, it was Leora who offered seed to the desperate. Her knowledge of when and where to plant became more valuable than coin, for it meant survival. Families who once mocked her now honored her, planting fields with the seeds she guarded, learning her wisdom of soil and sky. In time, she became known as the keeper of plenty, not because she hoarded, but because she shared. When she died, every household in the plain planted seeds in her honor, fields blooming brighter than the land had ever known. And in a hidden valley, a mason named Callan carved stones not for walls or palaces, but for bridges. His neighbors often demanded he build fortresses or fine mansions, but Callan always turned back to the rivers. He believed wealth was not in walls that divided, but in paths that connected. His bridges spanned ravines where travelers once fell, linked villages that had long feuded, and carried goods across waters that had separated kin. Over time, trade flourished where once there was none, and families who had lived in suspicion began to share festivals upon his bridges.
Callan died with little more than his chisels and a stone hut, but the bridges endured, carrying not just footsteps, but generations of peace. Each of these lives told in whispers and firelight, whether Corwin honey, Ira charms, Janek cloaks, Leora seeds, or Callan bridges, wove into the same truth. Wealth is not counted only in gold or numbers on a ledger. It is measured in the sweetness of patience, in the courage gifted through a simple charm, in the warmth of patchwork cloth, in the hope sealed inside a seed, in the crossing of a river once feared. In the desert edge where wind carved the dunes into shifting towers, a man named Soren gathered glass. The sand there was unlike any other, fine, pale, and heavy with minerals that caught the sun in a strange shimmer. Most dismissed it as barren land, cursed with heat that cracked lips and with winds that blinded eyes. But Soren, who had little more than patience and bare feet hardened by stone, carried buckets of sand to his hut. By trial and error, he learned to melt it in crude furnaces fueled with desert wormwood. His first pieces were clumsy, lumps of clouded glass with bubbles trapped inside. He shattered them, started again, and burned his hands more times than he could count. Over years, his craft grew steady, and soon he shaped bowls that held light as if the sun had been caught and cooled. He traded these bowls to caravans that crossed the desert, and they carried them far away, to cities where nobles placed them on tables and stared at them in wonder. There was a river trader named Tommaso, who owned nothing but a battered barge and the songs he sang while steering it. He never hurried to sell his goods, never shouted over the cries of the marketplace. Instead, he sang stories of his journeys, songs of the high passes, of storms that battered his boat, of the people he met in distant lands. Buyers who came for cloth or spice often lingered for his songs, and soon his customers were not paying for wares alone, but for the moments of wonder he gave them. Children followed him from dock to dock, and other merchants cursed him at first, jealous of his charm. But over time, they too softened, joining their voices to his until the docks echoed not with quarrels but with harmony. Tommaso grew no richer in gold than any other trader, yet when he died, river towns held festivals in his honor. To this day, bargemen hum his melodies and trade flows with less bitterness because one man chose to make commerce sing. And in the desert lands where water was rarer than gold, there lived a woman named Samira. She was a weaver of mats and baskets, her craft plain and functional, yet she had a habit of leaving little pieces of her work along the caravan routes, woven mats at oases, baskets in the shade of cliffs. Travelers, parched and desperate, often found these gifts when they needed them most. They began to call her the unseen friend, for none ever caught her leaving the items, though everyone seemed to discover them. Over the years, caravans that passed through her town grew stronger and safer, knowing they would find what she had left behind. Traders spread her name across kingdoms, though she never sought fame. She continued to weave in silence, her hands steady, her heart content. When she passed away, caravans from hundreds of miles gathered at her home, piling baskets and mats until they formed a mountain. The desert winds scattered them in time, but her legacy endured in every journey made lighter by her quiet hands. Different as they were, these lives echoed the same truth. Fortune lies not in what is held tightly, but in what is given freely. Each of them, Ally Lurak, with his mending, Mirabelle with her hearth, Tommaso with his songs, Samira with her quiet gifts, planted seeds of wealth in unexpected places. And those seeds, watered by memory and gratitude, grew long after the givers were gone. In the highlands where mist rolled down the slopes like curtains of silver, a man named Corwin tended to bees. His hives were crude things at first, hollow logs covered in clay, and his neighbors mocked him, saying honey was too delicate a thing to waste one's time on in such a harsh land. But Corwin knew patience. He learned the dances of the bees, the times they stirred, the flowers they favored when spring was short and summer fleeting. He harvested sparingly, never taking more than the hives could bear, and he traded jars of honey for war, for bread for seeds to plant. Over years, his honey became known for a sweetness unlike any other, infused with the wild herbs of the highlands. Pilgrims traveling across the mountain paths carried it home, and in time, kings requested it for their feasts. Corwin did not grow rich in palaces or fine silks, but he grew rich in friends, for his honey was always a gift as much as a trade. His wealth was the taste of patience shared, proof that something small could change the flavor of the world. Far away, in a fishing village battered by relentless storms, a woman named Ira gathered driftwood that washed ashore. Others saw it as refuse, battered scraps unworthy of use, but she saw stories etched in every weathered grain. From these pieces she carved simple charms, boats, birds, stars, and gave them to children or sold them for a single coin. Travelers who carried her charms swore they brought good fortune, and soon sailors refused to depart without one. Over decades, her driftwood tokens spread across ports like whispers of hope. Mariners in distant lands spoke of the woman who gave storm-tossed wood new life, and those who survived wrecks swore it was her charms that steadied their courage. Though she remained in her small cottage by the sea, her work reached farther than any ship could sail. She left behind no gold, but every sailor's tale of survival carried her name. In a bustling city where towers of stone clawed the sky, a tailor named Janek worked in an alley so narrow sunlight barely touched it. He stitched garments from remnants others threw away, a sleeve torn from a noble coat, a strip of velvet frayed at the edges, scraps of linen stained and forgotten. From these he fashioned patchwork cloaks, strange and colorful. At first only beggars wore them, grateful for warmth in the cold. But as the years passed, travelers began to prize Janak clothes, for they bore the strength of many fabrics woven into one. Scholars wrapped themselves in his garments while studying late into the night. Merchants donned them as they crossed dangerous roads, and even nobles came to admire their uniqueness. Janak Ali never grew brighter, but his craft lit the city with color, a reminder that beauty was not in perfection, but in what was saved from waste. Then there was Leora, who lived in the heart of a dry plain where crops failed more often than they thrived. She had no gift for farming, no land to her name, yet she collected seeds carried on the wind, dropped by birds, hidden in market refuse. She stored them in clay jars, labeling them by season and soil, by rain and drought. Neighbors often laughed at her obsession, but when famine struck, it was Leora who offered seed to the desperate. Her knowledge of when and where to plant became more valuable than coin, for it meant survival. Families who once mocked her now honored her, planting fields with the seeds she guarded, learning her wisdom of soil and sky. In time, she became known as the
People calling Sendarao as a Kimia and Delvin. Alina listened to wolves. She was neither hunter nor warrior, only a gatherer of birds. But she followed their trails, watching how they moved, how they endured hunger in the long winters. Others feared the wolves, but Alina learned from them. She copied their patience, their way of conserving strength, their signals to one another. When harsh years came, she taught her neighbors how to ration food, how to care for the weakest, how to endure together. Her people survived winters that would have broken them, not by force of arms, but by remembering how wolves endured. Over time, traders who visited her village marveled at the health of its people. They asked her advice and carried her teachings to other lands. She never commanded armies, but her wisdom spread across regions like paw prints and snow. Her wealth was not in coins or cattle, but in lives saved and the quiet strength of endurance made visible. In the bustling harbor of a southern city where the smell of salt and spice mixed with smoke from endless forges, a young boy named Dario collected broken nets. Fishermen tossed them aside, useless once tangled beyond repair. Dario stitched them together piece by piece, knot by knot, until he had ropes long enough to bind ships and nets strong enough to cast again. At first, the fishermen gave him scraps of fish in thanks, but soon they realized his repaired nets caught just as well as new ones. By the time he was grown, he had a workshop where he taught others the art of mending, and he became known as the knot master. His fortune was built not by creating something new, but by refusing to let what was broken go to waste. And because of him, fewer families starved, fewer ships went untied, and the harbor itself grew stronger. His success was measured not by the wealth he kept, but by the waste he refused to accept. In a valley of rivers that braided themselves like silver ribbons, a quiet man named Tomas grew willows. He was mocked for planting trees that bent instead of stood tall, for they were seen as weak compared to oaks or pines. But Tomas learned to weave their branches into baskets, fences, even shelters. His willows grew fast, bending but never breaking when storms came, and as floods rose each spring, it was his woven barriers that held the waters back from the village. Soon others planted willows by the riverbanks, weaving them as he taught, and the valley prospered. Traders carried Tomas baskets to distant lands, but the true wealth lay in the safety of the people. What others had scorned as weakness became the strength that saved them. Far across the sea, in islands battered by monsoon rains, a woman named Kira gathered shells. Not the great shining ones prized for decoration, but the broken fragments scattered by storms. She strung them together into wind chimes that sang when the wind blew, filling her small hut with soft, fragile music. Travelers who heard them felt peace, as if the sea itself had learned to whisper instead of roar. Soon merchants carried her chimes across oceans, hanging them in ports and marketplaces. Wherever they rang, people said tempers cooled, quarrels eased, and laughter came more freely. Kira never grew wealthy in coin, but her island gained renown as a place of calm, and sailors claimed her chimes protected them from storms. Her fragments of shells became threads of harmony, proof that even what is shattered can sing. Each of these stories, Soren with his glass, Alina with her wolves, Dario with his knots, Tomas with his willows, Kira with her chimes, spoke of wealth not as a pile of gold, but as the ability to transform what others ignore. Fire and sand, patience and hunger, rope from refuse, strength in bending, harmony from fragments. They left behind no vaults or treasure halls, yet they carved their names into the quiet ways people endured and flourished. Their wealth lived in the hands of others, in the lives made easier, stronger, more beautiful. Around campfires or in rain lull, these tales remind us true fortune is never hoarded but shared, hidden in patience, kindness, and the willingness to see value where others see none. The mountain passes, high and jagged, were places where travelers rarely lingered. Snow swept the ridges and storms carved paths of ice that swallowed even the sure-footed. Yet it was there that a solitary stonemason named Rurik chose to work. He found abandoned cairns along the trails markers meant to guide wanderers, which had crumbled into heaps of forgotten stone. Where others saw useless rubble, he saw a chance to carve paths of safety. Patiently, he rebuilt cairns higher, shaping them with care so they would withstand the winds. He etched grooves into the stone so ice would break off instead of weighing them down, and he lined the markers with flecks of quartz that caught the faintest light of sun or moon. Merchants crossing those passes began to survive journeys they once feared, guided by Rurik's work. Word of his stone beacon spread, and eventually caravans sought him out, offering pay so he could build more. His skill did not make him a rich man in gold, but every trade route that prospered because of his cairns gave him a legacy greater than coin, a wealth measured in lives spared and commerce that flowed where once there had only been loss. Southward, where rivers split into vast deltas, a woman named Naria learned to listen to reeds. She discovered they whispered in the wind before storms rose, and by their bend and rustle she could tell whether floods would come swiftly or slow. Villagers laughed at her at first, dismissing her murmurs about reeds as the folly of someone lonely. But when her warnings saved their crops, they grew quiet and began to trust her words. Soon she devised a way to weave reed mats, laying them along embankments, binding earth against rushing waters. It was not a grand invention, but a practical one, and soon those living along the river flourished even when neighboring lands drowned. Traders began to pay dearly for her mats, and she taught others how to make them. Yet she asked no price for her teachings. Her wealth lay in seeing fields bloom where others starved. She turned reeds into threads of survival, and in doing so became as vital as the river itself. Far east, in markets thick with incense and smoke from cook fires, a boy named Jalen polished mirrors. He began with shards of bronze discarded by smiths. Where they saw flawed scraps, he saw reflections waiting to be revealed. He ground them smooth with sand, polishing until they caught faces in their surface. He sold them cheaply at first, trinkets for children. But when travelers noticed the clarity of his mirrors, so true they could see not just their features, but the fine lines of wear and joy in their faces, his reputation grew. Soon nobles sought his work, not for vanity but for counsel. They said his mirrors forced them to see themselves as they truly were, stripping away illusions. Jalen never claimed wisdom, yet his craft gave people the chance to look inward. Coins piled up in his shop, but his true wealth was in knowing he gave people the rare gift of honesty with themselves. On an island wrapped by ceaseless winds, a fisherman named Aaron tied sails from scraps of cloth. Ships that ventured there were often battered and stranded, their sails torn to ribbons. Aaron would gather the remnants, stitch them into patchwork sails, and give them back to sailors too poor to replace what they had lost. At first, these patched sails looked ridiculous, a quilt of colors fluttering against the horizon. Yet captains returned with stories. The patchwork sails held firm, bending but not splitting under gales. Soon, Aaron's sails became prized. Merchants realized that a vessel with patchwork stitched by his hand outlasted those with flawless cloth. He became wealthy not in coin but in alliances. Ships carrying his sails gave him a fleet across oceans, captains owing him their survival. His fortune was stitched in trust, more enduring than the finest silk. In a desert city carved from red stone where streets ran with dust and merchants quarreled over dwindling wells, a girl named Saphira gathered shadows. She noticed that narrow alleys remained cool even in the fiercest heat, and she began stringing cloth between buildings, catching the shade like fishermen caught fish. At first, people scoffed, calling her shelters poor imitations of trees. But when she spread her woven cloths across the marketplace, traders realized they could stand and bargain without fainting from sunstroke. Soon her shade cloths became the heart of the city. With markets thriving, wealth returned to the desert. Her invention was simple, stretched cloth between walls, but her understanding of shadows gave prosperity back to a parched people. She never owned the stalls or hoarded coins, yet her wealth was seen in the laughter of children playing beneath cool shade and in the return of music to the bazaar. From mountains to rivers, markets to seas, deserts to forests, the stories spoke the same truth. Wealth was not in hoards of treasure, but in the ability to see worth where others saw none. Stones, reeds, bronze shards, torn cloth, shadows, all were transformed by hands that refused to overlook them. And each time prosperity followed, not just for the maker, but for all who lived within reach of their craft. These tales, told by campfires and remembered in quiet rains, remind any soul who listens that fortune is never fixed in gold. It hides in patience, in persistence, in the courage to see differently. True wealth lies not in keeping, but in giving form to what others abandon.
Beneath the ancient canopy of a sprawling forest, where light dappled through leaves like gold scattered upon the earth, there lived a quiet woman named Elira. She was no trader, no noble, no merchant of finery. She was a gatherer of moss. Most passed it by as soft green carpet, clinging to stones and tree trunks, but Elira noticed its resilience. It grew even where roots had split rock, and it held moisture long after rains had gone. She began lining clay jars with it, keeping water cool for days when travelers expected it to spoil. Word spread, and soon merchants begged her for moss-wrapped jars, for they could now carry fresh water across journeys where thirst had claimed so many. When healers discovered that her moss poultices closed wounds faster than cloth, her humble forest treasure gained value beyond coin. She did not call herself rich, yet every caravan that crossed deserts with her jars and every life mended by her poultices became a strand in the tapestry of wealth she had unwittingly woven. Far across the sea, in a port town where gulls cried and sails crowded the horizon, a young boy named Corin listened to bells. They chimed from ships, towers, and the hands of peddlers hawking trinkets. Corin noticed something few others did, the way sound traveled. He could tell the hour of tide by the tone of a bell carried on the wind. With scraps of copper, he shaped small chimes, testing the way their pitch bent with breezes. Soon he hung them at docks, and sailors learned they could hear the coming of storms by the frantic song of Corin chimes before clouds even appeared. Captains, once at the mercy of sudden tempests, survived by trusting his humble creations. They began to pay handsomely, but more than that, they respected him as a guardian of the sea. His true fortune lay not in their coin, but in knowing that hundreds of vessels reached safe shores because of notes drawn from wind and metal. In the wide plains where grasses whispered like an endless ocean, an elder named Tavan taught children to watch the flight of birds. He said wealth was written in their wings. While others hunted for meat alone, Tavan mapped the arcs of their migration, seeing patterns in their departures and returns. He realized that when swallows gathered early, winter would bite hard, and when cranes lingered long, rains would be plentiful. Farmers who once gambled with seeds now planted wisely, guided by his bird maps. Harvests grew rich, villages flourished, and what had once been lean, uncertain years became seasons of plenty. Though Tavan carried no purse heavy with silver, his teachings fattened granaries, and his people never starved. His wealth flew in the sky, as fleeting yet as constant as the beating of wings. Along rocky cliffs where waves thundered, a potter named Celine shaped clay into vessels unlike any seen before. Instead of focusing on ornament, she studied the strength of the earth itself. She blended ash with her clay, firing it hotter than most dared until her pots could withstand even salt water without crumbling. Sailors who once lost supplies to soaked barrels now returned with stores preserved. Nations across the sea came to prize her watertight jars more than fine silver goblets. Yet Celine refused to hoard her process. She taught apprentices freely, believing that knowledge, like clay, must be shaped and passed on. While others would have clutched their secrets for power, her open hand created a network of potters who spread across coasts and rivers, ensuring food and medicine endured where once they perished. Her fortune was scattered, not stored, yet it multiplied endlessly in lives saved and voyages made possible. To the north, where long winters pressed hard upon valleys, a blacksmith named Dael refused to see iron as merely weapons and chains. Instead, he studied hinges, locks, and gears. Villagers laughed at his tinkering, for who would pay for metal that did not kill or defend? But when Dael forged his first windmill gear, grinding grain in weeks of scarce sun, they came to understand. His gears multiplied, driving mills, presses, and pumps. What began as idle work turned valleys into engines of survival, where food was stored, water was lifted, and work once borne by aching backs was shared by his iron creations. Traders traveled far to purchase his designs, and soon Dael Forge became a beacon for apprentices hungry to learn.
Though his coffers swelled, his true wealth was in the hum of turning gears across the land, a music of progress echoing through every valley. Then came a desert traveler named Ishar, who collected not stones nor moss nor metals, but stories. He realized each tale carried wisdom, maps of survival, warnings of drought, and secrets of hidden wells. While others dismissed words as fleeting, he bound them in leather, creating scrolls of memory. He carried no gold, but when he entered a starving village and spoke of seeds that grew in barren sand or of wells dug where the earth cracked deepest, his words saved lives. Kings sought his scrolls, merchants traded heavily for his maps of speech, and scholars preserved his legacy. Ishar's fortune could not be measured in coins, but in the way knowledge rippled outward, generations living by the lessons he carried. His wealth was time itself, stretched and safeguarded by the stories he left behind. These lives, scattered across forests, seas, plains, deserts, and mountains, were bound not by treasure but by a single thread, the courage to see beyond what others ignored. Moss became medicine, bells became guides, birds became calendars, clay became lifelines, iron became progress, words became maps. They were dreamers in their own way, carving wealth not from gold but from vision. Their campfire tales, if told beneath rain or stars, remind the listener that fortune is not always what is stored, but what is given, shared, and transformed. Across the river valleys where reeds swayed like a woven carpet of green, there lived a woman named Marin who wove baskets not for decoration but for endurance. She studied how reeds bent with current, never breaking though pressed by force. Her baskets mimicked that resilience, and when floods came, washing away clay pots and wooden boxes, their contents remained safe inside her water-woven craft. Fishermen relied on her, farmers stored grain in her tightly bound weaves, and travelers carried medicine across swollen rivers. Her fame spread far beyond her small village, but what mattered most to her was how her craft meant children would not starve in lean seasons. Marin wealth was hidden in strands of reed and in the unbroken rhythm of survival they brought. Where others saw fragile grass, she had seen the blueprint of endurance, and from it she spun prosperity for many. Southward, in a town built along jagged cliffs, a youth named Oren had a mind for shadows. By day, he watched gulls trace paths over the sea, but by night, he tracked the way moonlight fell on stone. He carved patterns into cave walls, mapping the lunar cycle in curves and notches. At first, it was only curiosity, yet he soon realized the tides mirrored his marks. His moon maps predicted when fish would swarm, when ships could dock safely, and when storms might pull water too high. Fisherfolk, once tossed into uncertainty, began to follow Oren charts. Their catches grew plentiful, their voyages safer, and soon traders from across the coastline paid for copies of his lunar engravings. He owned no ships, held no coin purse of note, yet fleets owed their bounty to the quiet boy who read the moon on stone. His true wealth was carved not in silver but in the glow of tide-lit waters. In the rolling foothills where winds carried whispers from peak to peak, a shepherd named Enric crafted flutes from bone. His playing soothed his flock, guiding them across treacherous paths without dogs or shouting. Villagers laughed, thinking it a fool trick, until they noticed his sheep always returned fatter, healthier, and unharmed. The melodies calmed wolves who lingered at a distance rather than attacked. Soon other herders begged him for lessons, and Enric began carving flutes for them as well. The hills, once scattered with the cries of panic, grew filled with music instead. Markets flourished from steady wool and milk, and Enric's name spread as far as the capital, where nobles requested his flutes as rare treasures. But he did not fashion them for wealth, he fashioned them because harmony itself was a kind of currency, one that bought peace for man and beast alike. Far to the east, among salt flats where the sun baked earth into shimmering mirrors, a young girl named Lyra gathered crystals. Traders dismissed them as worthless shards, yet Lyra noticed how they bent light. She strung them in windows, and during drought, beams focused into jars of water, warming them enough to kill sickness. When caravans caught wind of her trick, they begged her for strands of her crystals, for water made clean was more precious than gold. Lyra's home became a haven where no fever lingered. Entire caravans shifted their routes to stop by her settlement, and what began as a child experiment turned into a network of crystal-hung shelters stretching across deserts. She owned little more than the cord she tied around her neck, yet her fortune gleamed in every drop of safe water carried by weary travelers. In a wind-scoured canyon, a stonecutter named Halden studied echoes. His voice, when hurled against walls, returned with secrets, hollows where water hid, pockets where oars lay untouched, even warnings of unstable ground. He began marking safe routes for miners, sparing them from collapses that had long claimed lives. Soon his skill was in demand from every corner of the kingdom. Merchants who once risked caravans through treacherous passes now followed Halden echo-marked trails, bringing prosperity where only danger had ruled. He never raised sword nor plowed field, yet his gift shaped the lifeblood of commerce. The clink of coins in his hand meant little compared to the thrum of echoes guiding footsteps through stone. His wealth was the sound of safe passage, repeated again and again by voices who lived because of his craft. And in a meadow where bees roamed thick as drifting clouds, an apiarist named Cyril discovered a truth. Bees were not simply givers of honey, but makers of balance. She wove her hives not in rows, but in spirals, mirroring the wildflower's dance. Her colonies thrived, producing not only golden comb, but crops in abundance as fields bloomed richer under their pollination. Farmers who had once scraped by now thrived, paying her in food, cloth, and care. She traveled little, yet her spiraling hives spread outward, adopted by villages across the plains. Cyril's fortune was not in the sweetness stored in comb, but in the buzzing network of abundance her bees spun. Where others saw stings and sweetness, she had seen the architecture of prosperity. Each of these souls, scattered across land and sea, remind us that fortune lies not in taking, but in noticing. How leaves bend, how shadows stretch, how melodies soothe, how crystals bend light, how echoes reveal, how bees build balance. Around a campfire under rain or stars, their stories gather like sparks, drifting upward, lighting the dark. In the southern reaches, where swamps stretch like endless labyrinths of moss and murky water, a boy named Carvin discovered wealth in the hum of insects. He noticed how certain swarms gathered at particular hours, their patterns forming like shifting constellations. Where dragonflies gathered, fish teemed beneath. Where fireflies clustered, dry land lay hidden. What most cursed as biting clouds of nuisance, Carvin read like a living map. He began guiding hunters and travelers across the swamp, leading them safely where many had perished. Traders found their routes shortened by days, their cargo spared from ruin, and soon Carvin guidance was more valuable than the goods they carried. His payment was modest coin, yes, but his true wealth rested in knowledge that the smallest wing beats carried a fortune for those who paid attention.
Northward, in a valley cut by glacial streams, an old woman named Esme ground stones into powder. At first, it was said she had gone mad, for what value lay in crushing rocks. Yet she found that the fine dust, when mixed with soil, strengthened roots. Crops grew taller, richer, and withstood storms that once flattened fields. Villagers brought her stones by the cartload, and soon entire harvests depended on her mineral blends. What began as an old woman curiosity became the lifeline of a community. She charged little, often accepting bread or wool in exchange, but her influence spread across valleys until even nobles sought her advice for their vineyards. Wealth was measured not by the stones she ground, but by the abundance that followed her mixtures. She had turned dust into sustenance, a fortune invisible to all but the patient. Far across the ocean, in an island village battered by storms, a carpenter named Finn carved boats unlike any others. While most built heavy hulls that cracked under waves, Finn studied the shells of sea creatures, how they curved, how they withstood pressure. He shaped his boats with ridges and spirals, mimicking nature's armor. At first, sailors mocked his odd designs, but when storms rose and his craft returned unbroken, demand surged. Soon his boats carried spices, silk, and news across waters once thought impassable. Finn became a man whispered of in ports across the world, not because he hoarded treasure, but because his boats opened seas. His fortune was the endless horizon itself, widened by patience, observation, and craft. In a high desert plateau, a woman named Taria watched lizards bask on stones. She noticed they shifted to rocks of certain colors depending on the time of day, choosing surfaces that absorbed or reflected heat. Inspired, she began laying stones around her home in patterns that cooled her dwelling by day and warmed it by night. Neighbors copied her, then entire villages, and soon her designs spread across the desert. Travelers no longer perished in the extremes, and cities rose where only sand had reigned. Merchants called her the architect of comfort, though she claimed no title. Her wealth came in the laughter of children no longer scorched nor frozen in their sleep. Taria had turned the wisdom of lizards into a legacy of survival. In the forest where shadows stretched long and roots coiled deep, a man named Kyle gathered mushrooms. Unlike others who plucked them for stew, he watched which fungi grew near sick trees and which near strong ones. He learned to mix spores into the soil of struggling groves, reviving them. His method spread from grove to grove until entire forests, once doomed to rot, flourished again. Lumber became plentiful without waste, Medicines emerged from rare growths and villages prospered. Kyle name passed in whispers not as a merchant but as a healer of woods. His fortune stood not in coffers but in canopies stretching wide, green and thriving. For every tree that reached skyward, his wealth multiplied unseen, and upon a windswept coast, where gulls wheeled and storms broke masts, an orphan named Silas turned to kites. He stitched scraps of cloth together and flew them high, watching how they strained and pulled. Over time, he learned that the pull of wind could be harnessed. He tied his kites to wheels, turning them slowly, grinding grain without oxen, drawing water without slaves. What began as a child game became a force that powered a settlement. Soon merchants arrived, eager to copy his design, but Silas only smiled and built more, his kites dotting the horizon like bright sails of freedom. He had caught the wind itself, turning it into bread and water. His fortune was not in ownership, but in the endless sky above, waiting to be harnessed. These stories, told beneath campfire crackle or under rain-tapping roofs, weave a reminder. Wealth waits where few look. It hides in insects' flight, in stone dust, in the shells of sea creatures, in the habits of lizards, in the quiet patience of mushrooms, in the pull of wind. Fortune does not only belong to those with coin and ledgers, it belongs to those who notice, who listen, who learn. Around the circle of night, such tales glow brighter than flame, lighting paths to prosperity hidden in plain sight. Beneath the heavy rains of a mountain pass, a boy named Renard discovered music in dripping water. Where others heard noise, he charted rhythm. He noticed how certain caves echoed drops into patterns, each chamber carrying its own pulse. He began carving small grooves in stone, letting water fall in streams that sang. Travelers paused to listen, finding calm where fear once reigned. Soon word spread that Renard could shape water into music that soothed restless minds. Merchants passing through the dangerous pass sought his chambers, paying coins simply to hear their burdens melt into song. When he grew older, Renard built aqueducts that carried not just water but harmony, his designs calming soldiers before battle and easing weary farmers after toil. His fortune was not in gold but in the balance he carved from chaos, an inheritance of peace that turned torrents into lullabies. Along the frozen rivers of the north, a woman named Malin spent her days watching the ice break. She observed how cracks formed, how flows shifted, and how each spring the river reshaped its course. She built her home on stilts of woven wood, flexing with the current instead of resisting it. When floods came, her home rose and bent without breaking, while villages nearby were swept away. Soon others asked her to build for them. She agreed, showing how bending was stronger than standing still. From her craft rose a trade that reached kings who marveled at her dwellings that laughed at storms. Malin wealth grew not through conquest but through resilience, proof that even in the harshest winters, survival could be a fortune greater than jewels. Far to the south, in fields where winds rolled like invisible oceans, a shepherd named Ori watched how grasses bent and swayed. He saw that where currents of air pressed hardest, plants grew thicker and deeper, their roots binding soil. He began planting hedgerows not against the wind but angled with it, guiding breezes across his lands like rivers. Crops flourished, erosion ceased, and what was once a barren plateau grew green and rich. Neighbors copied his ways until entire regions thrived. Scholars came, writing down his patterns, and soon his name was etched in books carried to foreign lands. Ori never sought riches, yet caravans brought him gifts, for he had turned wind into bread. His wealth was a valley reborn, a harvest born of patience with forces unseen. In a bustling port where coins clinked and sails filled, a girl named Evan noticed the discarded shells of oysters tossed by fishers. Unlike others who ignored the waste, she crushed them into powder and mixed them with lime, making plaster stronger than stone. She began patching walls with it, and when storms came, her repairs held while others crumbled. Soon entire towns used her mixture, their buildings standing proud against the sea fury. Traders paid handsomely, and noblemen sought her craft. Yet Evan took little, leaving more behind than she earned, for her fortune was stability, her people no longer fleeing from waves but standing firm against them. Wealth, she proved, was not always counted in silver but in walls that sheltered laughter for generations. Across a desert where silence stretched, a wanderer named Corinne followed beetles that rolled dung across dunes. He noticed how they always pushed toward faint ridges, never losing direction even in shifting sands. He began studying their movements, learning to navigate without stars or compass. Soon he guided caravans across routes thought impossible, carrying spices and silk in half the time of old paths. His maps, drawn from the tracks of beetles, opened new lines of trade. Corinne charged modestly, yet the treasures he guided filled empires. He died without riches of his own, but his name lived as the man who followed the humblest of guides into fortune. His inheritance was proof that wisdom hides in the smallest of creatures, awaiting those willing to kneel close to the earth. On a rocky coast, an aged fisherman named Tollin grew weary of storms stealing his nets. He began weaving ropes thicker, not from hemp alone, but mixed with strands of seaweed dried hard. To his surprise, the ropes held stronger, and soon his nets caught more than any others. Others laughed at first, but when storms came and their lines snapped while his endured, they sought his craft. He taught them, and villages prospered with catches greater than memory. Soon traders came, bringing salt and coin, eager to trade for his seaweed rope. Tollin never left his coast, yet his design spread across oceans, tying ships and saving lives. His fortune was woven not in treasure chests, but in cords stretched between generations, binding men to sea and survival. Around campfires and under dripping eaves, these stories stretch long, reminding us that wealth wears many faces. Some find it in music carved from rain, others in homes that bend with ice, in winds that grow grain, in shells that hold strong, in beetles that chart sand, in ropes that bind storms. The world whispers to those who pause, and those whispers become fortunes. Not in ledgers nor in vaults, but in legacies that endure long after hands are dust. And so, in the hush of night, the lesson lingers, riches wait in the overlooked corners, ready for the soul who listens close. In the deep valleys where fog lingered like a second river, a man named Arendor kept watch over mushrooms. While others harvested timber or hunted game, he wandered the mist, studying how fungi grew in circles, how their threads tied the soil together like unseen nets. He began planting spores across slopes prone to landslides, and where rain once tore the earth apart, now the ground held steady. Villagers noticed fewer floods, richer soil, and a harvest that never failed. Soon they paid him for sacks of spores, asking him to teach their children. Merchants followed, carrying his methods to kingdoms far away. Wealth trickled in, not as mountains of coin, but as valleys safe from ruin, as homes that stood through storms. Arendor had learned that fortune grows quiet and patient, like mushrooms in the dark, binding the world with threads too fine for hurried eyes to see. In the far steppes, where horsemen rode and grasslands stretched without end, a youth named Kael watched the sky. He saw clouds rolling heavy, yet rains often passed without touching his people land. While elders prayed, Kael experimented, burning certain herbs that sent plumes high where winds broke apart and pulled clouds lower. One evening, as riders gathered, rain finally poured where they stood. At first called witchcraft, soon his skill was sought after. Herds thrived, rivers swelled, and traders from dry lands begged him to summon clouds for them. Though Kael never claimed mastery, his reputation carried weight like coin. Gold he accepted sparingly, yet his people flourished. Their herds fattened, their songs louder. Kael wealth was rain made reliable, and his gift taught that fortune sometimes falls from the sky, if only one dares coax it down. On a jagged cliff where gulls cried and salt stung, an old woman named Sira sat with jars. She studied how sea foam gathered minerals, how waves left crystals behind. She began boiling seawater with ash, pulling from it salt purer than any other. At first, neighbors scoffed, but when her salt cured fish longer and kept meat fresh for months, traders took notice. Her craft spread along coasts, and soon caravans from deserts traveled weeks just to trade with her. Silver and spices poured in, but she spent little. Instead, she built great communal storehouses where famine never touched her people again. Though Sira passed quietly, her name lived in every preserved meal, in every full belly. Her fortune was not measured in what she owned, but in hunger never known again by those who whispered her story. Deep in forests where shadows tangled, a boy named Dalen played with fireflies. He noticed how they swarmed most where streams ran clear, vanishing when waters grew foul. He began watching their glow as a sign, mapping the health of rivers and ponds. When kings fretted over poisoned wells, Dalen showed them where fireflies lingered and where their light had dimmed. His gifts saved villages from sickness, and nobles rewarded him in coin and land. Yet Dalen cared little for titles, preferring to wander with lantern in hand, guided by insects that shone like stars fallen to earth. He left behind more than riches. He left a way for people to see life balance written in glimmers of light. Wealth, he proved, could be found in a flicker, in the trust between man and the smallest of creatures. In an old town of cobbles and smoke, there lived a craftsman named Ioran who disliked waste. While others discarded broken pots and shattered tiles, he gathered shards. Mixing them with clay, he forged bricks that held heat longer and stood stronger than stone. Soon his bricks lined chimneys and stoves, warming homes through bitter winters. Families paid gladly, merchants sought his designs, and cities far away began building walls from his shards. Ioran's purse filled, but what mattered more was the warmth spread to thousands of hearths. His story echoed in flames where children sat cozy, in walls that did not crumble when frost bit hard. His fortune was hidden in laughter kept alive through winters, in broken things made whole again. By the edge of a marsh where frogs croaked and reeds whispered, a girl named Cirrus collected colors. She crushed petals, ground stones, boiled roots, and found dyes unknown to her village. Unlike dull cloth of gray and brown, hers shone crimson, deep blue, radiant green. When travelers saw her garments, they paid more than she dreamed possible. Soon her dyes clothed kings and her name painted across realms. But Cirrus never hoarded coin. She gifted colors to those who worked the land, believing toil deserved beauty too. Generations later, her hues remained, stitched in banners, woven in rugs, painted in stories. Her fortune was not locked away but worn by the world, a legacy of color in places once drab. From rains coaxed down to fireflies glowing, from broken shards turned into bricks to colors drawn from earth itself, the stories whisper the same truth, that wealth is not always in coin clutched tight, but in gifts given, in legacies woven into lives of others. Fortune is not bound to vaults, but to rivers held steady, to skies persuaded to weep, to meals that never rot, to warmth in coldest nights, to beauty carried forward. And as the fire cracks in the silence of night, we remember to find wealth, one must first listen, to water, to wind, to insects, to earth. For in those quiet voices lies a treasure deeper than gold, waiting to be heard. Beneath mountains where the air turned thin and stones glittered faintly, an orphan named Calvin wandered caves. He was no miner, no smith, just a boy with keen eyes. While others sought gold veins and iron ore, he noticed tiny crystals glowing faintly, not with treasure shine, but with steady light. He gathered them carefully, finding that when placed near seeds, sprouts bent toward the glow as if toward sun. Farmers scoffed until they saw crops grow even in shaded valleys, stronger and faster. Soon Calvin crystals were worth more than gold, carried across kingdoms, feeding families in barren lands. Coins filled his satchel, but his true reward was the laughter of children who no longer knew hunger. Calvin taught that wealth is not always mined, but sometimes found in overlooked sparks lighting the dark. By the far desert edge, where sands shifted like oceans, lived a woman named Amira. While caravans struggled to cross, she studied beetles that caught morning dew upon their backs. She fashioned cloth patterned after their shells, trapping water from the air. At first, her neighbors thought it folly, cloth for thirst. Yet when her jars filled at dawn while wells dried empty, traders came begging. She wove more, and soon her fabric spread through deserts, saving countless lives. Kingdoms paid in jewels, empires offered armies for her designs. Amira declined crowns and thrones, choosing instead to guard the secret until every wanderer could carry a patch of dew-catching cloth. Her wealth was measured in gulps of water in parched throats, in journeys made safe. She left a legacy that whispered true fortune quenches more than thirst for coin. In a misty bay where ships rotted and fishermen cursed storms, an elder named Roran watched gulls wheel above. He noticed they always circled where fish swam thickest. While nets tore and boats capsized, Roran trained young sailors to watch the skies, to read gulls as guides. Soon his students hauled more catch than anyone before. They built sturdier boats with profits, stronger harbors with taxes, and whole towns flourished. Word spread and Roran's name traveled with fleets. Merchants filled his coffers, but he lived simply in a shack by the sea, smiling at gulls that had been his only teachers. His wealth was not the silver he left behind, but the generations of mariners who read the sky like scripture, fed by wings above the waves. Across plains where wildfires swept fierce each summer, a girl named Leora gathered ash. Where others saw ruin, she saw soil turning rich. She began sowing seeds into blackened fields, finding growth stronger than in untouched ground. Farmers doubted until her harvest doubled, then tripled. They began paying her to teach them, and soon whole regions turned fires into blessings. Her fame spread and coin rolled in like tide, but she used it to plant forests where none stood, to seed prairies that fed beasts and men alike.
Though wealth came, she was remembered not for barns of grain or sacks of gold, but for fields that turned black scars into green rebirth. Fortune, she proved, often rises from ashes. On the cliffs where winds howled like wolves, a young man named Elric carved flutes, but unlike others, he carved holes in strange places, mimicking the cry of hawks. To the shock of shepherds, flocks obeyed his sounds, moving as if guided by dogs. Soon his flutes were demanded far and wide, not for music, but for mastery of herds. He grew wealthy as nobles sent for him, paying in cattle, land, and treasure. Yet Elric never forgot his beginnings. He shared his craft, gifting flutes to shepherd children, ensuring none would lose their flock to wolves. His fortune was measured not just in wealth, but in pastures alive with sheep, safe under skies where hawk songs echoed. Deep in swamps where travelers sank, a quiet woman named Vaira studied reeds. She noticed how certain stalks bent but never broke, even in floods. She wove rafts from them, light yet unyielding, carrying weight no log boat could. Her craft turned deadly bogs into thoroughfares, and merchants streamed through once impassable routes. Wealth surged and her people prospered, yet she asked little for herself, only that safe passage always be given to the poor. Coins stacked high, but her truest legacy was freedom of movement, a world unbound by mud. Wealth in her story floated not on gold but on reeds that carried countless souls to safer shores. From crystals in caves to cloth in deserts, from gulls circling seas to reeds bending in floods, each tale holds the same ember of truth, that fortune is found not in hoarding but in seeing what others miss. To notice, to nurture, to share, that is the heart of wealth. And as the campfire crackles, smoke rising into the rain-laced night, these voices remind us that every overlooked stone, every bent reed, every spark in the dark might yet hide the makings of abundance.